Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another Deepest Lore. I'm here, and joining me, Simon Roberts. Welcome back, sir. It's been a six-week break for Deepest Lore.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, chat as well. It's lovely. It's been such a quiet summer, hasn't it? Nothing's been happening. It's the usual silly season stories about cheese rolling and jam, and we've got nothing to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, there's been so much derailment of, I was happily writing my little course, and we were doing our Adam Curtis shows, and then the rudeness of Sunak interrupting things with the election, and then the rudeness of the person who tried to shoot Trump, and then the rudeness of Joe Biden inserting Harris into things. Oh, and the rudeness of my family for wanting a holiday. And now we've got, what do they call him? Busy old fool, unruly son, causing temperature issues. It's absolutely boiling today, Simon. 30 degrees here.
Oh, very mild by Australian standards.
But you're not in Australia, are you? You're also here in Blighty.
I am. I went back to Australia in November last year, though, and there wasn't a day where it was under about 35. It was just cripplingly hot. And I used to live there, and you sort of come to an accommodation when you're younger. But, past the age of 40, you just, as we say, don't need the action.
Oh, sorry. How do you cope with it?
You just do what Australians do. You stay inside, you pull the blinds down, so you open the windows slightly to let a bit of breeze through, and you stay inside and you drink cold drinks. And they don't go rushing around. Usually they send people home from work if they're, out working in the street or on a roof or something when it gets past about, 32 degrees or something like that. But our friend Chris Gard is a roofer in northern Queensland, and he must have absolutely brutal heat and humidity to work.
What you're saying is that Gard is a slacker who spends all his time indoors sipping weak lemon drink.
Absolutely, yeah,
and not doing any work.
He's a Simon Quinlank of the show. He's a king of hobbies. And I did notice, though, I saw a picture of him reading a book by one Edward Bernays recently called Propaganda, which we may touch on in the course of the stream. I don't know.
Interesting. People asking where Horus was never going to come on for the Century of the Self. He wanted to come on specifically for Mayfair set, and may come into later shows, but he was only down to do those shows and seemed to want to keep it that way for some reason. I mean, he's always welcome, of course. But we're going to be talking about Bernays, and really we're hitting what is, in my opinion here, Simon, peak Curtis. I mean, really, from here on out, this is like, if I was to make a really tortured analogy, let's say The Living Dead was another side of Bob Dylan. Now we're hitting like Bring It All Back Home, Highway 61, Blonde on Blonde. It's just all bangers from here out. By the time you get to hypernormalization, that's like Blood on the Tracks or something. There's no weak Curtis from here on out, basically.
Yeah, I've only got Pink Floyd analogies for my limited musical knowledge. Maybe it's Dark Side of the Moon. Maybe it's Wish You Were Here.
And maybe can't. What's that later one? That one that people are a bit iffy on. Can't Get You Out of My Head. Maybe that's The Wall or something. Maybe that's the Wall.
Yes.
Baggier Curtis. Anyway. Just before we get going, I have to remind everyone, it is the summer sale, 25% off all courses. Buy it now. I mean, the best way to do it, buy one of those bundles, and I've never quite made the exact calculation, but the 25% promo code plus the discount from the bundle, you're stacking it. It's like casting mage armor and mage shield. It's a +8 to your AC bonus. Promo code Scorcher. Buy it now. Ow! It's the academic agency summer sale. Use the promo code Scorcher. 25% off all courses. Scorcher. Get it now. Scorcher. 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 Promo code Scorcher. 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 Buy it now. What do you think of Bernays would make of that one?
He'd love it. He'd absolutely love it. It goes straight to the cerebral cortex.
Yeah, you can't miss what the promo code is.
It's Scorcher, by the way.
Yes. Although I was not inspired by Bernays for that advert. It was actually a little-known mid-century German propagandist who worked in the Ministry of Information. Repeat it every day. Do you remember?
I simply can't imagine who.
Anyway, do you have anything you want to promote, Simon, before we get started?
No. All content on this fine channel and by the friends of the channel and myself on Twitter at Simon__Roberts.
He hated it. Said he wanted this stuff.
100 years ago, a new theory about human nature was put forward by Sigmund Freud. He had discovered, he said, primitive sexual and aggressive forces hidden deep inside the minds of all human beings. Forces which, if not controlled, led individuals and societies to chaos and destruction. This series is about how those in power have used Freud's theories to try and control the dangerous crowd in an age of mass democracy.
Can I just say a second? I mean, is Curtis walking right up to the line here? I mean, Sigmund Freud's theories and how those in power have used those theories to control the masses. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it?
Pulling back the curtain, Wizard of Oz moment. It's interesting also talking about, just your recent experiences, glancing over your Twitter timeline, that there's been a lot of back and forth about people arguing with you about the sentiments of the crowd, perception of influence, especially with all the Kamala polling and the JD Vance thing, all this sort of heightened intensity of feeling.
Yes, but also increasingly, Simon, how, let us say, the progenitors of Sigmund Freud, the, people he would have looked out for back in his day, also use social media to manipulate and misdirect. The slop accounts I've drawn people's attention to. I mean, we didn't get a chance to talk about this on Unpopular Opinions yesterday, but I frankly think it's disgusting the way large social media accounts, thousands of miles away, were basically manipulating the response to what was going on in Southport, and propagating misinformation and disinformation about what was going on in an already tense situation. You're starting to see the fallout from it today, and I think it's a problem. I think it's a real problem, and all I can do is point out that it's happening, and try to rise above the reeing and baying mob to, calmly explain what is actually happening, and to just be aware, to not let. I mean, yes, emotions are high. Yes, you're angry about what's happened, but that doesn't mean you should give carte blanche to people who are ostensibly your enemies to try to direct your righteous anger, towards their political and geopolitical ends, frankly.
And weirdly, as we're going to talk about Freud, there's a lot of Oedipal dynamic going on, that there's a lot of people seeing you as the kind of the father who has to be supplanted, and sort of trying to sort of take you on in some way to achieve self-actualization. It's just a funny Freudian dynamic.
At the heart of the story is not just Sigmund Freud, but other members of the Freud family. This episode is about Freud's American nephew, Edward Bernays. Bernays is almost completely unknown today, but his influence on the 20th century was nearly as great as his uncle's. Because Bernays was the first person to take Freud's ideas about human beings and use them to manipulate the masses.
You know, when he said Bernays is almost completely unknown today.
Classic Curtis.
This is one of those things where I am, like, to me, Bernays is second nature knowledge, and I've known about him for so long that I just assume that he's widely known about. But that's probably untrue.
Did you look into Bernays before coming across this? Because, I mean, this is one of those Curtises that came to me a lot later, and it was, quite mind-blowing and revelatory when I saw it. Was Bernays something you came across before coming across this?
Yeah, when I was doing my research into Thinking Fast and Slow, I mean, I didn't watch this when it went out at the time. I was probably when did this was made? 2000. Was it 90? No, 2002. 2002. Yeah. 2002. Okay. Yeah. When was The Trap then?
The Trap, a bit later. I think that's about 2010, something like that.
I seem to remember. No, The Trap was 2007.
2007, right?
Okay, right. Yeah, the Trap was the first Curtis I kind of sat up and took notice, and I watched this one a lot later. But yeah, I came across Edward Bernays when I was researching the Thinking Fast and Slow stuff and the Jonathan Haidt stuff about, persuasion and things like that. And Bernays came up quite a lot as somebody who, was already into kind of top-down reprogramming of people's dreams, their intuitions, because that's really the if you're a marketer or a persuader, what you actually want to do is actually get in to the point where you change people's instincts, their dreams, as opposed to reaching them on a cognitive level. You want to, as Bowden said, you want to get underneath the mind. And, well, as we'll see, but Bernays was very much about that. So,
He showed American corporations for the first time how they could make people want things they didn't need by linking mass-produced goods to their unconscious desires. Out of this would come a new political idea of how to control the masses. By satisfying people's inner selfish desires, one made them happy and thus docile. It was the start of the all-consuming self, which has come to dominate our world today. Freud's ideas about how the human mind works have now become an accepted part of society, as have psychoanalysts. Every year, the psychotherapist's ball is held in a grand palace in Vienna.
This is the psychotherapy ball. Psychotherapists come, some advanced patients come, or former patients come, and many other people, friends, but also people from the Viennese society who like to go to a nice, elegant, comfortable ball.
But it was not always so. 100 years ago, Freud's ideas were hated by Viennese society. At that time, Vienna was the center of a vast empire ruling Central Europe. And to the powerful nobility of the Habsburg court, Freud's ideas were not only embarrassing, but the very idea of examining and analyzing one's inner feelings was a threat to their absolute control.
Can we pause there?
Yeah.
Just an interesting echo there in the way that Curtis uses the footage of the architecture of the ball, and you get that glimpse into that sort of, privileged strata of society that we have the echoes of in the Mayfair set, where you've got these privatized worlds which are the locus of power in a sense through, very small numbers of elites, and part of what we're seeing with this documentary is the way that there's a redistribution, if you like, of those insights and that contestation of power through this medium of industrialized psychotherapy. I just reflected upon it because I was looking the other day on my my YouTube feed. I sometimes get interviews from Navarra come up, because you'd mentioned the one about John Gray, which I went and watched. It was very interesting. And I would say some of the interviews on Navarra are quite interesting to watch. And in particular, there was one from an FT journalist called Simon Cooper, called How the UK establishment works. And it's a sort of little interesting postscript to us watching the Mayfair set, in that hasn't disappeared, that world. It's moved largely to a place called 5 Hertford Street, which is a sort of nightclub where there's someone called Lulu's. I think Andrew Neil used to mention it a lot on This Week. And that's the place where the oligarchs and the Labour aspirants now go to make things happen. So in a sense, that elite opulence is still there.
Very, very interesting. I'll also mention really quickly that one of the long-standing critiques of Freud as regards the old world and the modern world, or the 20th century and before it, is that what Freud did successfully was to replace the priest, the confession booth, with essentially a secularized, you might even say, or re-theologized person who was not a Christian, and in Freud's case, explicitly not Christian. Yes. So that is something that I've heard many different people, commentators, say in the past. So.
And that feeds into Bernays' technique, as we'll see shortly as well.
You see, at that time, these people had the power. And of course, you just were not allowed to show your bloody feelings. I mean, you just couldn't. You couldn't, if you were unhappy. Can you imagine, for instance, you sit somewhere in the country in a castle, you are deeply unhappy, you are a woman. You couldn't go to your maid and cry on her shoulders, or you couldn't go into the village and complain, about your feelings. I mean, you couldn't, it was like selling yourself to somebody. You just couldn't, because they had to respect you. Now, of course, Freud, put that thought very much into question, because you see, to examine yourself, you would have to put a lot of other things into question, your society, everything what surrounds you. And that wasn't a good thing at that time.
Why not?
Because your self-created empire, to a certain extent, would have fallen into bits much earlier already.
But what frightened the rulers of the empire even more was Freud's idea that hidden inside all human beings were dangerous instinctual drives. Freud had devised a method he called psychoanalysis. By analysing dreams and free association, he had unearthed, he said, powerful sexual and aggressive forces, which were the remnants of our animal past. Feelings we repressed because they were too dangerous.
Freud devised a method for exploring a hidden part of the mind, which we nowadays call the unconscious.
Ernest Jones. Now, I recognise this name, Simon, because he wrote the seminal Oedipal reading of Hamlet.
That's right. I knew I was the reason I knew about him as well. Yeah.
Yes, the Oedipal reading of Hamlet is from a book by Ernest Jones. I actually thought he was a Shakespeare scholar.
And I think isn't this the one, influenced Olivier's performance, I think, maybe.
Yeah, I didn't know he was a direct colleague of Freud's. That's interesting. I'd never seen him before. Very interesting. Incidentally, I mean, there's obviously something, okay, we could say, well, it's been used for evil, or it's unleashed kind of bad forces in society. But it's clear that there is something to Freud. Even if a lot of the work was not very scientific, or was, this bit or that bit wasn't proven, the basic idea that there are instinctual primal drives that are held down for whatever reason seems to be true. I mean,
Yes.
I mean, it seems to be an invert. I mean, to come back to the confession booth, it's always seemed to me to be an inversion of the traditional 7 deadly sins or the vices that Aquinas talks about, which are deliberately in a Christian society, held down, deliberately controlled. And even if you go back to the Stoics or the ancient, the ancient Greeks, the whole idea is that you overcome those emotions, you overcome the base and the low through, reason.
Yeah.
And Freud seems to invert that or turn it upside down.
I think this is the thing I was thinking about when we came up to this, because I was apprehensive about the subject of Freud. We've often heard on the channel, we talk about the danger of psychologizing, and that tends to be a sort of strategy, in your opponent, where they try to sort of characterize you as psychologically deficient in some way, and rightly we can be dismissive of that, but it is also important to say that the psychology of human nature, which I may often relate to Shakespeare, is a thing that we need to actually sort of run our fingers through and consider why Freud's techniques were so powerful. And indeed, when you were talking there's a quote from Freud actually, which I picked up about. He talks about the heroic, and he says a hero is a man who stands up manfully against his father and in the end victoriously overcomes him. So he does define these kind of waypoints of development that people undergo. And I mean, just briefly, I might just say it now. There's obviously one of the big things about Freud is his 3-part model of the personality: the id, the ego, and the superego. And these terms might come up later in talking about this documentary. The notion with Freud is that these roughly correspond to parts of the self. And the id is, if you like, the childlike, spontaneous, sensual part of the self. And it roughly corresponds in some other forms of analysis to the child, the inner child. The superego is roughly correspondent to a parental voice, the father or the mother that's wagging its finger at you and telling you what you should be doing, that makes you feel guilty. And the idea of the ego, this is something that gets kind of corrupted because, I mean, we're talking in terms of this documentary as the underpinning of the Boomer Truth regime. The idea of the ego gets corrupted much later in the sort of 60s and 70s as, the bad part of yourself that's kind of willful. But in Freud's model, the ego is actually the executive function of the adult in you that mediates between the voice of the inner child and the superego, the parent. So people often think people go to psychoanalysis or therapy, to get rid of your id, to get rid of your inner child, or to get rid of your parental voice. But the way it's conceived of in therapeutic situations is that you retain all of these parts of yourself. And sometimes they may be useful. Sometimes, you want to go to a party, you have fun, you employ your id in that setting. And sometimes you need to be responsible, sweep up the leaves in the garden, pay your taxes, and that's the superego talking. But the ego, the adult, essentially makes our executive decisions. It's our own inner elite, and that's an important sort of distinction to hold in mind as we go on, because these ideas come up and are exploited by the various waves of political elites and psychotherapeutic elites as we go on, as the sort of twists and turns of the story go back and forwards.
Yeah, very interesting. I think even in if you go to therapy now, they talk about becoming the parent and becoming the child, even if you're dealing with another adult. They talk about like being allowed to be your child self and your parent self. It's all very weird, and it kind of may make us feel a bit uncomfortable. But this stuff
there is a danger.
This stuff is like rampant in current society, isn't it?
The sort of industrialized, scaled out version of psychotherapy is something which is problematic, for want of a better word, and something we need to be wary of in some sense.
With support that is totally unknown to our consciousness, that there exists a barrier in all our minds which prevents these hidden and unwelcome impulses of the unconscious from emerging. Good night.
In 1914, the Austro-Hungarian Empire led Europe into war. As the horror mounted, Freud saw it as terrible evidence of the truth of his findings. The saddest thing, he wrote, is that this is exactly the way we should have expected people to behave from our knowledge of psychoanalysis. Governments had unleashed the primitive forces in human beings, and no one seemed to know how to stop them. At that time, Freud's young nephew, Edward Bernays, was working as a press agent in America. His main client was the world-famous opera singer Caruso, who was touring the United States. Bernays' parents had emigrated to America 20 years before, but he kept in touch with his uncle and joined him for holidays in the Alps. But Bernays was now about to return to Europe for a very different reason. On the night that Caruso opened in Toledo, Ohio...
I just want to mention really quickly, Simon, because this is something that I do like to remind people of. America as a nation basically has has had historically almost no defense mechanism against this sort of thing, due to its kind of willingness to accept immigrants, basically, in the 19th century, in the 20th century, and so a character like Bernays, you can see him here going to America, hooking up with his uncle, all of this sort of stuff. It's like, well, it's just I'm always reminded of the line from Scarface, by Tony Montana. It's just one big pussy waiting to get fucked. Remember? Yeah, because it is just like a kind of. I know the Wild West analogy is overused, but it's just kind of like, yeah, you could try your luck there, even if the entire Venetian elite society completely rebuffs you, or there's enough antibody mechanisms in Europe at that time still left.
Yeah,
basically nothing stopping him going and conquering America. So that's what happened, and then through America conquering the rest of the world, basically.
And why America is so prone in a way to the idea of the therapy culture, because obviously the flip side of the pioneer spirit and independence is dissociation, loneliness. And you see, perhaps I think in next week's episode, one of the earlier psychiatrists talking about the sort of profound depths of misery that he encounters traversing America. So it doesn't, as you say, have these kind of antibodies. There isn't the village church necessarily in the same way it exists in Europe in a parochial, tiny sense. It's, it's a sort of a vastness that swallows people up, whether it's in the city or whether it's on the prairie.
And also the entrenched ruling classes that had been there for hundreds of years. That when we watched the Mayfair set, and also when we watched Ocean's Park by Curtis, you saw how over the course of the 20th century, those entrenched ruling classes were BTFO'd by these emergent forces coming from America that essentially then, by the end of the century, they're basically gone.
Yes. And the willingness to adopt technology is interesting here, because I do smirk a little bit at Curtis's narration where he said, on the night that Enrico Caruso opened in Toledo, Ohio, Caruso is one of Bernays' clients. Enrico Caruso, for those who don't know, he was the first big recording star. So he was someone who had a scale influence on the masses, which was deployed by these technical means of, cutting discs, which made him fabulously wealthy, even by the standards of today. And it set the tone for people like Bernays into thinking about people in the plural, in the thousands, in the millions. Mm-hmm. How do you get at the common denominator of taste and interest? And I think that's just something it's a funny little Curtis touch that he adds a sort of seemingly irrelevant event in, but that's, I think, part of his homage to John Dos Passos, the novelist I talked about when we discussed the Mayfair set as one of his influences, who's this great American state of the nation novelist who uses chunks of prose text interspersed with news reports and a sort of camera eye view of society as it's moving around dynamically, to give a sort of newsprint sense, a news footage sense of what's going on.
Excellent. Okay, let's carry on.
America announced it was entering the war against Germany and Austria. As a part of the war effort, the US government set up a Committee on Public Information, and Bernays was employed to promote America's war aims in the press. The President, Woodrow Wilson, had announced that the United States would fight not to restore the old empires, but to bring democracy to all of Europe. And Bernays proved extremely skillful in promoting this idea, both at home and abroad. And at the end of the war, he was asked to accompany the President to the Paris Peace Conference.
Then, to my surprise, they asked me to go over with Woodrow Wilson to the peace conference. And at the age of 26, I was in Paris for the entire time of the peace conference that was held in the suburb of Paris, and we worked to make the world safe for democracy. That was a big slogan.
Wilson's reception in Paris astounded Bernays and the other American propagandists. Their propaganda had portrayed Wilson as a liberator of the people, a man who would create a new world in which the individual would be free. They had made him a hero of the masses. And as he watched the crowd surge around Wilson, Bernays began to wonder whether it would be possible to do the same type of mass persuasion, but in peacetime.
When I came back to the United States.
So dark, isn't it? So dark. And I honestly think this is one of the stories of the two world wars, by the way, which is the story of the governments in general, not just Bernays, but the governments of the West, figuring out that the powers that they had acquired during wartime can be utilized in peacetime.
Yeah.
And this is one of the things that I am convinced, we talk about Boomer Truth, how the psychological operations of the world wars never stopped. The psyops that we talk about, they never stopped.
Yes.
And of course, this is an obsession of Curtis's as well, which is why we love watching him. So,
and it's why this is such a great sort of key documentary, if you like, a key text, if I can almost say go that far, that it's something you can internalize, this documentary, because it is about the lingua franca of power with a capital P, and that's not the same thing as retail politics, what we would call rank punditry. The real sort of musculature under the surface is this stuff. This is how they think. They think in terms of aggregates. They think in terms of, if you like, creating these noble lies, and then the reality which we are trying to map. That's thing.
And this is one of those things that Pharaoh, who was on Unpopular Opinions last night, attracted a lot of anger in the comments because he was focusing on the perception management, and he was talking about how the government had failed basically to manage the narrative about what happened in Southport. Now, people are angry because he wasn't like rabble rousing basically, and they were calling him a middle class fairy and things like that. But the fact of the matter is that Pharaoh, as somebody who's au fait with all of this stuff, understands how the governments think, understands how our elites think, because it is, they are foxes. So everything is a question of perception management in exactly the way that this documentary is about to outline. So
100%. And I can I just say that was a great episode. It wasn't depressing last night's. The second half, I thought he made a brilliant, sensitive speech about how parents feel about these things. I think that's something that's kind of getting a little bit lost there. There's one quote I always remember from the Blair years. I've searched for it online since. But it was I remember clearly, distinctly, clear as a bell, Blair saying it once. He said, "Perception is as important as the reality."
There he is, the Dark Lord as ever. Finger on the pulse of, how power works in our corrupt modern world.
In the States, I decided that if you could use propaganda for war, you could certainly use it for peace. And propaganda got to be a bad word because of the Germans using it. So what I did was to try to find some other words. So we found the word Council on Public Relations.
Bernays returned to New York and set up as a public relations counsel in a small office off Broadway. It was the first time the term had ever been used. Since the end of the 19th century, America had become a mass industrial society, with millions clustered together in the cities. Bernays was determined to find a way to manage and alter the way these new crowds thought and felt. To do this, he turned to the writings of his uncle Sigmund. While in Paris, Bernays had sent his uncle a gift of some Havana cigars. In return, Freud had sent him a copy of his general introduction to psychoanalysis.
Pause.
Go on, Simon.
Bernays was a cigar influencer.
You know, Sigmund Freud apparently smoked 20 cigars a day. And I've never quite understood that because, I mean, if you go back and have a look at this cigar he's smoking here, you just show...
Bernays had sent his uncle a gift of some Havana cigars. In return, Freud had sent him a copy...
Now have a look at that, right?
Mm.
In the Cuban range, that's at least the size of what they call a perla, which is a Monte Cristo 5 size. Okay, it could even be a Petit Corona. Now it takes me at least half an hour, 45 minutes to smoke a cigar of that size. In fact, if it's a Petit Corona, more like an hour.
Yeah.
And if he smoked 20 a day, he must have. Literally constantly had a cigar in his mouth, and also only slept for 4 hours a day. If
you go and do some Googling about Freud and his cigars, you come up with some fascinating stuff. I mean, essentially, people were saying, he just smoked right throughout the therapy sessions. The only thing in the room would be the sound of his voice and cigar smoke. And I did a tweet about this earlier because I found out apparently he used to smoke some. His favorite was an Austrian. I don't know what it means, an Austrian cigar, but it says an Austrian cigar called a Trabuco, which was kind of a small, compact cigar. But his other favorites were a Don Pedros and Reina Cubanas. These were Cuban cigars, but those two brands actually ceased to exist after Castro got in. And
yes, and while there's a brand called Vegas Rubana in honor of that family who are still around in Cuba. One of the few families who stayed, actually. Most of the others, like that, left. Famously, what are they called? What's the famous one? The Dominican brand.
What? Romeo and Juliet, Bolivar?
No. They all stayed. They've been nationalized, but there's a Davidoff. That's the big famous one. They left. They were a Cuban cigar, but the family left when the revolution happened, and they set up shop in the Dominican Republic. So now, if you can still buy Davidoffs, but they're from Cuban seed. So
wow. Certainly check out his cigar interest. It's really fascinating. He quotes, "Smoking is one of the greatest and cheapest enjoyments in life, and if you decide in advance not to smoke, I can only feel sorry for you."
Certainly not cheap now, Sigmund, mate. But if those Austrian ones were smaller, Simon, that probably makes the 20 a day claim. They could have been like what they call cigarillos. That would, they're much smaller, so that would make sense if they were only 20 minutes long. But that one he's smoking there is a proper Havana, I can tell. Anyway, let's carry on.
Of his general introduction to psychoanalysis. Bernays read it, and the picture of hidden irrational forces inside human beings fascinated him. He wondered whether he might make money by manipulating the unconscious.
What Eddie got from Freud was indeed this idea that there is a lot more going on in human decision-making, not only among individuals, but even more importantly among groups, than this idea that information drives behavior. And so Eddie began to formulate this idea that you had to look at things that would play to people's irrational emotions. And you see, that moved Eddie immediately into a different category from other people in his field and most government officials and managers of the day who thought if you just hit people with all this factual information, they would look at that and say, oh, of course. And Eddie knew that was not the way the world worked.
Bernays set out to experiment with the minds of the popular classes. His most dramatic experiment was to persuade women to smoke. At that time, there was a taboo against women smoking, and one of his early clients, George Hill, the president of the American Tobacco Corporation, asked Bernays to find a way of breaking it.
He said, we're losing half of our market because men have invoked a taboo against women smoking in public. Can you do anything about that? I said, let me think about it. And then I said, have I your permission to see a psychoanalyst to find out what cigarettes mean to women? He said, what'll it cost? So I called up Dr. Brill, A.A. Brill, who was a leading psychoanalyst in New York at that time.
How come you didn't call your uncle? Why didn't you call your uncle?
Because he was in Vienna.
A.A. Brill was one of the first psychoanalysts in America. And for a large fee, he told Bernays that cigarettes were a symbol of the penis and of male sexual power.
Perfect, isn't it? Yeah.
No, I do not want people thinking that about cigars, because big brown thing.
Apparently, the saying "sometimes a cigar is just a cigar" is attributed to Freud, but it's like one of those George Orwell kind of pseudo quotes. There isn't actually any evidence in saying it.
Okay.
He told Bernays that if he could find a way to connect cigarettes with the idea of challenging male power, then women would smoke, because then they would have their own penises.
Incredible.
Every year, New York held an Easter Day parade to which thousands came, and Bernays decided to stage an event there. He persuaded a group of rich debutantes to hide cigarettes under their clothes. Then they should join the parade, and at a given signal from him, they were to light up the cigarettes dramatically. Bernays then informed the press that he had heard that a group of suffragettes were preparing to protest by lighting up what they called torches of freedom.
He knew this would be an outcry, and he knew that all of the photographers would be there to capture this moment. And so he was ready with a phrase, which was torches of freedom. And so,
can I just say, by the way, I know several boomer women who smoke cigarettes, and this idea that they're connected with freedom and that they don't want that taken away from them still manifests today. And it's almost like a kind of point of pride that they know all of the health risks and so on that comes with cigarettes, but they do it anyway, type thing.
They're a hard-boiled girl boss.
Yeah, defiantly. Yeah.
So here you have a symbol, women, young women, debutantes, smoking a cigarette in public with a phrase that means anybody who believes in this kind of equality pretty much has to support them in the ensuing debate about this, because torches of freedom. I mean, what's on all American coins? It's liberty. She's holding up the torch, you see? And so all of this is there together. There's emotion, there's memory, there's a rational phrase, even though it's using a lot of emotional elements. It's a phrase that works in a rational sense. All of this is together. And so the next day, this was not just in all of the New York papers, it was across the United States and around the world. And
I'm thinking about my Foundations of Rhetoric course and all of the stuff I read around that, Simon. And I do think there's a kind of modern hubris where it's like, oh, these things are all discoveries. I mean, the idea that people haven't understood that people can be emotionally manipulated. You only have to read Shakespeare to understand that they knew that there was a kind of power to words. I mean, in the Elizabethan era, they even attributed it to magic, that words can have magic. And there's a famous scene in Julius Caesar where Mark Antony, friends, Romans, countrymen, during the course of that speech, he completely changes the crowd around, and Shakespeare shows how easily and passive, feminine and fickle the mob are. And he rightly feared them as well. Same in the Henry VI plays with Jack Cade. Jack Cade gives that rabble-rousing speech, and they go rampaging in London. So I do find it slightly irritating that they're like, ooh, this is some great, this is our high verbal IQ, guys. We've worked this out. I mean, people knew for a long time. And all of those defense mechanisms that you saw in Vienna, and also in this country, the stiff upper lip and the, keep your emotions, stay stoical and so on. We're basically defense mechanisms against the power of rhetoric and against the manipulations. And what these guys did essentially was weaken them. They weakened them against a population that had actually built up defenses over generations.
Yeah, and this is a thing that Bernays represents here. There's this shift away from sort of, 18th and 19th century industrial, factualism. Of just giving people sort of bald statements about the world and kind of leaving out the poetry, because as you say, you look at Mark Antony's speech in Julius Caesar, you literally come from endorsing the conspirators who've murdered Caesar to turning the crowd against them within a few short paragraphs. And it's the sort of post-Dickensian kind of Victorian capitalist rationality that Bernays starts to realize you can subvert by fusing these mythic resonances with human dreams and the subconscious, and you get away from that sort of purely descriptive mode of power that is just based in just having knowledge. That's kind of not enough from Bernays's point of view.
Yeah, and of course, sadly, he's right. This is what people are like, as we've seen. And in fact, as time has gone on, the population has only become more passive, feminine, easily manipulated, easily led. Even in real time, like we watch it every day. So.
And there's one interesting story I'll just say about this Torches of Freedom story. I did a little bit of digging on this. So what happened was there was a lady called Bertha Hunt, who was a sort of self-made female activist. And what she did was she sent telegrams to the top 10 US debutantes. These were the kind of who would you do girls of the day, and got them to come on this New York Easter parade. And she did it by telling a story about how she'd been out and a man on the street had publicly shamed her for smoking. So Bernays this story is about the use of social anxiety as a kind of driver for women to be independent, right? Mm-hmm. And so she sent these telegrams out and got these women to come along, and it just so happens that she was Bernays' secretary. And actually, sort of slightly contrary to Curtis's narration, Bernays didn't really inform anybody directly about what was going on. He was working with American Tobacco, but he did it through this seemingly spontaneous event that he set up with this secretary of his who he'd persuaded to, turn into a feminist and get all these women along. So it was a complete put-up job. And that was the model of Bernays's, the publicity stunt, initiating the kind of social change.
Very interesting. And, politicians still do a bit of that. It's like I was talking to Carol from Birmingham the other day, all of that sort of stuff. Or, let's take some questions. You, the chap in the blonde. And sometimes our guys are like, hold on a second, we've seen that guy before. He was in this crowd. He was in this crowd. Oh, actually, he's a Labour activist.
I saw our friend Nathan Hood earlier actually musing about why the events in Southport and the various sort of spasms of violence had come about suddenly almost under this Labour government. And I'm not going to infer any conspiracy nature here or anything like that. But it's always interesting to contemplate, as you say, what they want you to notice and what they don't. So as you've said earlier, they want you to be focused on the Hugh Edwards story today as a deflection from everything else. That's not just random.
No, and if you go on any news site right now, it is huge splash, Hugh Edwards. And they're almost treating Southport like a local story today, which is very, very telling.
From that point forward, the sale of cigarettes to women began to rise. He had made them socially acceptable with a single symbolic act.
What Bernays had created was the idea that if a woman smoked, it made her more powerful and independent, an idea that still persists today.
Embrace me, my sweet
It made him realize that it was possible to persuade people to behave irrationally if you link products to their emotional desires and feelings. The idea that smoking actually made women freer was completely irrational, but it made them feel more independent. It meant that irrelevant objects could become powerful emotional symbols of how you wanted to be seen by others.
Eddie Bernays saw the way to sell product was not to sell it to your intellect, that you ought to buy an automobile, but that you will feel better about it if you have this automobile. I think he originated that idea, that they weren't just purchasing something, but they were engaging themselves emotionally or personally in the product or service.
I have to comment. There's a guy in the chat saying, I love how AA always criticizes the US Foundation and how it leaves them open to subversion from the UK, which was equally subverted in all the other countries of Europe. You didn't listen closely to what I said. I said America was uniquely open to this sort of thing. And basically, once they took over there, they used America as the base to launch further psychological attacks then on all the rest of Europe, which, over the course of 2 world wars was sufficiently weakened, basically decimated their ruling classes, especially the First World War. And so, all of Europe then was ripe for the picking. And I'm not making this up. You can read people who were there at the time talking about, how in the aftermath of the Second World War, I remember that there's the Evola essay where he's in Italy, in Rome in the 1950s. You think about how Catholic and conservative 1950s Rome would have been. But he talks about how slowly but surely the radio waves were, classical music was replaced with American rock and roll, and the Italian DJs of the time were, sticking American slop on the air and trying to promote things like jazz and so on and so forth. Or you can have a look at Henry Ford writing in the 1920s about jazz and how they infiltrated, how various mechanisms were used to subvert America in the first place. So, I mean, again, this is just what happened. If these people, for whatever reason, set up shop in America and used the power base of America and the 2 world wars, for better or for worse, to then conquer the minds of all of the Europeans who are now fully Americanized. This country more than any other. So I don't deny that. I don't deny that. All of these countries were subverted, but you have to look at the source of the subversion. And frankly, it comes from what used to be called American media imperialism or cultural imperialism, which, at one point was something Americans were proud of. They're actually, and catch a patriot on a good day, and they'll actually be proud of Hollywood, depending on where your bread is buttered. So, I mean, am I making this up, Simon?
I don't disagree with any of that, I'm afraid.
That it's not, you think you need a new piece of clothing, but you'll feel better with the piece of clothing. That was his contribution in a very real sense. We see it all over the place today, but I think he originated the idea of the emotional connect to a product or service.
What Bernays was doing fascinated America's corporations. They had come out of the war rich and powerful, but they had a growing worry. The system of mass production had flourished during the war, and now millions of goods were pouring off production lines. What they were frightened of was the danger of overproduction, that there would come a point when people had enough goods and would simply stop buying.
Sorry to stop again. There's a guy asking in the chat, what years did America begin to subvert Europe? I mean, in the case of Britain, it really started in the 1920s and the 1930s. And it's covered extensively, not only by Adam Curtis in Oceans Apart, but in the book America Conquers Britain by L. Denny, which is actually mentioned by Curtis on that documentary, where they look at how quickly and efficiently the American corporate model, bought up a lot of British industry during that time. and how American advertising methods, like those developed by Bernays, were used basically to completely BTFO the previous brand. I mean, because let's face it, the British Empire had a brand, Simon, right? And there was branding in the 19th century capitalist British mode, British products, right? Imperial tobacco and all this sort of stuff. America had more advanced advertising methods developed by people like Bernays, and it swept through Britain like, easily, and everything American became cool. And if you go back and watch the first episodes of this Reviewing Adam Curtis series, the Oceans Apart one, he literally shows the adverts, and he shows women from that time talking about how it was cool to be American. And then so that had started before World War II, and then during and after World War II, that was the time where it truly did conquer. Both kind of actually and in terms of the dreams, hopes, and desires, not just of Brits but of French and Germans, darker, but yes, the Germans too, and Italians and everybody. And there was a bit. I mean, it wasn't like there was no resistance from the Europeans, and the French especially always had more rearguard action. That's the whole story of de Gaulle. But slowly but surely, the McDonald's empire has defeated the old empires of Europe. That is just a fact.
And I suppose, if we wait, we're getting, a little further ahead into the documentary, but it'll talk about the stock market crash. And, to use a Freudian term, I suppose that in a sense may be the trauma or the inflection point where the model begins to change in terms of mass market capitalism. Bernays is introducing this concept of seeing the individual in a relation of tension and approval to his or her decision or peer groups, but not as massed nations or an ethnos, but as people linked by social status seeking. Yes. So in their small friendship groups, family groups, town groups, maybe, it sort of is in a way a form of mass control to the propagandist, but it also limits the network availability to the individuals involved. They don't have the means to proliferate the messaging in so much as they are the carriers of the message, so to speak, if you see what I mean. They don't enjoy the relation to a central focus of mass power like the king, the Kaiser, the emperor, whatever. They are simply becoming componentized in the system to sort of be the transport medium for the ideas of people like Bernays, which effectively viralizes for the first time.
Yeah, if you read Bernays, he actually directly talks about invisible dictators. That's his phrase in the book Propaganda. There are invisible dictators who actually control your choices, whether you know it or not. Your choice of shirt, your choice of cigarette, say, your choice, whether you like Coke or Pepsi, whether there are people who influence you in ways that you don't perceive or you don't even know. So that's his language. It's also worth, on the American point, it's worth saying that they did a real number on America too. I mean, let's not forget that in the space of 20, 30 years, these people completely transformed what it meant to be American. From the original stock Americans, you might call, to this notion of the propositional nation, the nation of values and all this stuff. I mean, we talked a bit about this on UO last night. The changing of what the Statue of Liberty meant, the poem of the Statue of Liberty. This is stuff that friends of ours have done, like Horus and Black Pilled and various other people. They've done whole shows on just that process of how just the idea of America was completely turned inside out. Especially that poem that's on the Statue of Liberty and how it came to be there and who was involved with it. I mean, those are stories in and of themselves, but it's part of the same process that we're watching.
Up until that point, the majority of products were still sold to the masses on the basis of need. While the rich had long been used to luxury goods, for the millions of working-class Americans, most products were still advertised as necessities. goods like shoes, stockings, even cars were promoted in functional terms for their durability. The aim of the advertisements was simply to show people the product's practical virtues, nothing more. What the corporations realized they had to do was transform the way the majority of Americans thought about products. One leading Wall Street banker, Paul Mazur of Lehman Brothers, was clear about what was necessary. We must shift America, he wrote, from a needs to a desires culture. People must be trained to desire, to want new things even before the old have been entirely consumed. We must shape a new mentality in America. Man's desires must overshadow his needs.
What do you think about Curtis slipping in the long Hans Zimmer note there?
Oh, lovely. I love all this moody, eerie atmospherics that Curtis does. Yeah.
Classic, Curtis. Classic.
We need some long corridors in a moment.
Prior to that time, there was no American consumer. There was the American worker, and there was the American owner, and they manufactured and they saved and they ate what they had to, and the people shopped for what they needed. And while the very rich may have bought things they didn't need, most people did not. And Mazur envisioned a break with that, where you would have things that you didn't actually need, but you wanted, as opposed to needed.
And the man who would be at the center of changing that mentality for the corporations was Edward Bernays.
Bernays really is the guy within the United States, more than anybody else, who sort of brings to the table psychological theory as something that is an essential part of how, from the corporate side, of how we are going to appeal to the masses effectively. And the whole sort of merchandising establishment and sales establishment is ready for Sigmund Freud. I mean, they are ready for understanding what motivates the human mind. And so that there's this real openness to Bernays' techniques being used to sell products to the masses.
Beginning in the early 20s, the New York banks funded the creation of chains of department stores across America. They were to be the outlets for the mass-produced goods, and Bernays' job was to produce the new type of customer. Bernays began to create many of the techniques of mass consumer persuasion that we now live with. He was employed by William Randolph Hearst to promote his new women's magazines, and Bernays glamorized them by placing articles and advertisements that linked products made by others of his clients to famous film stars like Clara Bow, who was also his client. Bernays also began the practice of product placement in the movies, and he dressed the stars at the film's premieres with clothes and jewellery from other firms he represented. He was, he claimed, the first person to tell car companies they could sell cars as symbols of male sexuality. He employed psychologists to issue reports that said products were good for you, and then pretended they were independent studies.
I mean, it's just, isn't it just remarkable, Simon? Remarkable.
Yeah. I mean, it's the classic techniques we see today of you set up a front organization or a publication in order to, ratify the conceptual shift that you want to make and give it a sort of formality and a respectability. And Bernays is the arch originator of this kind of technique. I will also say that while we consider Bernays, we should also just mention there is a guy called Ivy Lee, who is another guy who is regarded, he's slightly earlier, he didn't live as long as Bernays, as another father of modern public relations. But his work was generally focused around the Rockefeller family. So there's he's less well known, I suppose, than even Edward Bernays. But he helped the Rockefeller family out at around this time. They were having union problems with one of their mines in Colorado. And the Rockefellers sort of decided to deal with the industrial dispute by, sending the militia down and just shooting the miners, basically. And Ivy Lee came into his own by approaching the Rockefellers and saying, maybe we need to deal with this situation by you going down there and listening to their concerns. This is after they'd shot these people, which was interesting, But very similar to the Keir Starmer approach of going down to Southport and bringing some flowers and then like an automaton walking off.
Yeah, I mean, it has been shocking to see how less skilled than the Master Blair Starmer has been in that situation. But
we're in for some fun with it.
I mean, Blair was very good at that, going down and showing your concern. That's essentially what he did in the Northern Ireland peace process. He disarmed his opponents by just essentially just knowing their arguments and repeating them back to them, and that they felt that they felt then that he wasn't a complete enemy.
It's exactly what Ivy Lee did with the Rockefellers. He got Rockefeller Jr. to go down. There was this thing called the Ludlow Massacre, where about 20 miners and some of their families had got killed by this detective agency and the National Guard from Colorado, who Rockefeller had paid to go out and sort out this dispute. And then Ivy Lee persuaded Rockefeller Jr. to go down there and sort of meet them socially and listen to their concerns, which is kind of amazing if you think about it. He's going down to say, well, we've killed your families, but we're here to listen to your concerns.
My gosh,
it's astonishingly cynical. But
and I bet some of them were cap in hand, yes, Mr. Rockefeller. You can imagine the deference he would have had.
There you go.
He organised fashion shows in the department stores and paid celebrities to repeat the new and essential message. You bought things not just for need, but to express your inner sense of yourself to others.
There's a psychology of dress. Have you ever thought about it? How it can express your character? You all have interesting characters, but some of them are all hidden. I wonder why you all want to dress always the same, with the same hats and the same coats. I'm sure all of you are interesting and have wonderful things about you, but looking at you in the street, you all look so much the same. And that's why I'm talking to you about the psychology of dress. Try and express yourselves better in your dress. Bring out certain things that you think are hidden. I wonder if you've thought of this angle of your personality.
I'd like to ask you some questions. Why do you like short skirts?
Oh, because there's more to see.
More to see, eh? What good does that do you?
What's my answer? It makes you more attractive.
It does?
Pause here.
Go on.
Just look at the peak truck physiognomy in some of those leering goons.
Yes, I was reminded a little bit, Simon, of the men in Fritz Land's Metropolis. When she's doing that dance, and you've got the kind of leering.
Yeah, it's like he's, at the end, the journalist is sort of waving the camera. Shut the camera off now. And you don't know what happens next. I don't know.
They probably all had a piece of a short skirt.
Oh, because there's more to see.
More to see, eh? What good does that do you?
What's my answer? It makes you more attractive.
It does?
In 1927, an American journalist wrote, "A change has come over our democracy. It is called consumptionism. The American citizen's first importance to his country is now no longer that of citizen, but that of consumer." The growing wave of consumerism helped in turn to create a stock market boom. And yet again, Edward Bernays became involved, promoting the novel idea that ordinary people should buy shares, borrowing money from banks he also represented. And yet again, millions followed his advice.
He was uniquely knowledgeable about how people in large numbers are going to react to products and ideas and so on. But in political terms, if he were to go out, so I can't imagine that he could get 3 people to stand and listen. Wasn't particularly articulate, was a kind of funny looking, and didn't have...
My God, is that Harvey Weinstein, Simon? He looks just like Harvey Weinstein. Same physiognomy, same look. I've often wondered, by the way, what Bernays would make of today's elites. Because I
was just thinking the very same thing. Yeah,
just be shocked by how far they've fallen really from these days.
But the conversation about anticipating the mind of the crowd right now, like I was saying about your, discussions earlier about the polling in America, if Bernays, had that sort of interest to give a take on that, it'd be interesting to hear how he'd read the situation.
Any sense of reaching out for people one-on-one? None at all. He didn't think about people in groups of one, thought about people in groups of thousands.
That is truly dark if you think about it, isn't it? He only thought in terms of group psychology.
Yes.
Very dark.
And that's a key. Well, that's a key thing that we identify as a problem. Don't you know? It's like the sort of the meme on Twitter of you make a statement and then there's somebody in the comments who say, "But I'm not like that." There's that inability to think in the aggregate about these things, and that kind of differentiates, I suppose, people in power from us ordinary people who are looking at these things and constantly framing ourselves in terms of the individual. They simply don't think like that.
I'm surprised that Gustave Le Bon's The Crowd has not come up yet, because that is the prototype book for a lot of this stuff.
It was an influence on Bernays, I understand. Yeah,
it was written in the 1890s, but that's where he says that the crowd is always passive, always easily led, and that you must think in terms of the mass psychology, not in terms of the individual. If you're ever going to move them,
And the psychology involves those mythic resonances I talked about, and symbols and signifiers. I mean, our friend Semiagog will have mentioned Saussure, who also fed into Bernays' thinking.
I would have nothing to do with it. Hello?
Bernays soon became famous as the man who understood the mind of the crowd. And in 1924, the president contacted him. President Coolidge was a quiet, taciturn man and had become a national joke. The press portrayed him as a dull, humorless figure. Bernays' solution was to do exactly the same as he had done with products. He persuaded 34 famous film stars to visit the White House. And for the first time...
Can I sorry to interrupt again,
no.
But Kamala Harris is literally at this moment surrounding herself with celebrities.
Totally. I was hoping you'd stop it there, because I was going to say, is this going to be a Starmer thing? Because he's bland as well. Is Tone going to organise a Cool Britannia for him? Down at number 10.
He didn't have any of that really. Blair, of course, Brit Award to David Bowie, and Oasis at number 10, and Spice Girls and all the rest of it. But there's been very little celebrity endorsement of Starmer.
But you have this interesting dissonance of, and this is a modern phenomenon. Like you can put those sort of glittering celebrities around these very, very bland people, these politicians, and it doesn't really matter. Like Coolidge there, like Starmer, these don't have to be people with a message or a meaning. And this sort of dynamic of offsetting them by this glamour it feeds into. I mean, I talked about some sort of modern leftist cultural critique when we did the Mayfair set, but this feeds very much into what they call communicative capitalism now, where content is immaterial. What is material to capitalism now is creating stimulus response loops. That's all that matters. It's like Twitter as a model of communicative capitalism. It's feedback reputation, and that in itself generates that locus of power, because we all know Twitter is where those people interested in that, journalists, politicians, NGOs, go to communicate the needs of power. And so leadership in the personal charismatic sense becomes a much less powerful mode. And that's why people like, I suppose, Nigel Farage somewhat stand out in today's environment.
Yeah, I'll just say really quickly that I talk about politics as pro wrestling. In pro wrestling, the term for when you're trying to get somebody over with the crowd who is not over. Let's say there's a new wrestler who comes into the territory, or there's somebody struggling to connect with the fans. You buddy them up with somebody who is already over, and they call it giving them the rub. Right? So you get somebody who doesn't have a lot of talent, let us say Brutus the Barber Beefcake, and you say, well, the thing is, Brutus Beefcake is really good friends with Hulk Hogan, and Hulk Hogan comes out and says, yeah, my friend at the end, Brutus Beefcake, you know, he's a great guy. And because Hulk Hogan connects with the fans then, by transference, like Brutus Beefcake. And this is exactly the same process where it's like, well, I like this celebrity, I like that celebrity, they're with this person who I don't really know or like. So there's some transference goes on. And, you know, this is what will happen if, let's say, Taylor Swift says, oh, you know, I really like Kamala Harris, by the way, or Beyonce or something like that. There is some transference. Although I would say that after 100 years of this, modern people are a little bit more sophisticated and skeptical of these techniques because they're so tried and tested now. But it still does work, basically. So
the dissonance is very but the dissonance lays very heavily on people's minds, that they see these kinds of you know, you sort of have it in the media sphere in the UK. Let's say you have these outlets like GB News or something like that, and they take on these personalities. I mean, I think of the sort of Tom Harwoods of the world, who are kind of this sort of non-personality celebrities in a way. They're kind of completely fabricated. There's nothing to them, but they create these stimulus response loops of, you know, clickbait anger and so on, and that gets the business going. That's all that's needed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting, very interesting.
Politics became involved with public relations.
And I lined up these 34 people, and I'd say, what's your name? He'd say, Al Jolson. I'd say, Mr. President, Al Jolson. Next day, every newspaper in the United States had a front page story. President Coolidge entertains actors at White House. And the Times had a headline which said, President nearly laughed. And everybody was happy.
I mean, if you were him, you would probably get some sort of thrill from knowing you had that much power, basically, to make that happen. Must be a thrill for him. You know, you could tell he was chuffed with the result, right? Kind of reminds me of Iago. So, you know, kind of getting a thrill out of little manipulations.
But while Bernays became rich and powerful in America, in Vienna his uncle was facing disaster. Like much of Europe, Vienna was suffering an economic crisis and massive inflation, which wiped out all of Freud's savings. Facing bankruptcy, he wrote to his nephew for help. Bernays responded by arranging for Freud's works to be published for the first time in America, and began to send his uncle precious dollars, which Freud kept secretly in a foreign bank account.
He was Freud's agent.
Now you see the power of the international, the internationalism of these people, because not everybody's got an uncle in Vienna, right? Or not everybody's got a nephew in New York. So this is just one small example of how that network effect has worked historically to the advantage of, you know, people like Sigmund Freud,
if you will, to get his books published. Well, of course, once the books were being published, Eddie couldn't help himself but promote these books, see that everybody read them, make them controversial, emphasize the fact that, do you know what Freud says about sex and what he says cigarettes are a symbol of, and so on and so forth? How do you suppose all those stories got out? Certainly the academics weren't spreading these around the country. Eddie Bernays was. Then, when Freud became accepted, well then, of course, to go to a client and say, well, Uncle Siggy, see, then that had some cachet. But notice there, first Eddie created Uncle Siggy in the U.S., made him acceptable, secondly, and thirdly, then capitalized on Uncle Siggy. Typical Bernays performance.
Bernays also suggested that Freud promote himself in the United States. He proposed his uncle write an article for Cosmopolitan, a magazine that Bernays represented, entitled A Woman's Mental Place in the Home. Freud was furious. Such an idea, he said, was unthinkable. It was vulgar, and anyway, he hated America.
Based Freud.
Freud was now becoming increasingly pessimistic about human beings. In the mid-20s, he retreated in the summers to the Alps, sometimes staying in an old hotel, the Pension Moritz in Berchtesgaden. It is now a ruin. Freud began to write about group behavior, about how easily the unconscious aggressive forces in human beings could be triggered when they were in crowds. Freud believed he had underestimated the aggressive instincts in human beings. They were far more dangerous than he had originally thought.
After World War I, Freud was basically a pessimist. He felt that man is an impossible creature, a very, very sadistic and bad species, and did not believe that man can be improved. Man is a ferocious animal, the most ferocious animal that exists. They enjoy torturing and killing, and he didn't like man.
Pause there. Just to simply say that it's very interesting that Freud, at this point, as he says, he's pessimistic. He kind of rejects. I mean, so much of the Boomer Truth regime, I suppose, is descended from the Enlightenment view of the perfectibility of man, and the ability for the individual to sort of change infinitely, and self-actualize, and Freud rejects this at this point. And it's interesting and ironic that there's this sort of perhaps element of reaction that we can understand in Freud.
I mean, to put it in Thomas Sowell's terms, Simon, he adopts the tragic vision of life, which is always associated with the right.
Yeah, and essentially, in the end, though, he also gives us this sort of this mode of therapeutic introspection that leads to the civilizational suicide we're undergoing at the moment.
Dark, very dark.
The publication of Freud's works in America had an extraordinary effect on journalists and intellectuals in the 1920s. What fascinated and frightened them was the picture Freud painted of submerged, dangerous forces lurking just under the surface of modern society. Forces that could erupt easily to produce the frenzied mob which had the power to destroy even governments.
Now, if this was me re-editing this in 2024, Simon, I'd intersperse bits from the Paris Olympics opening ceremony and possibly the Republican National Congress shenanigans and things like that. Because
the dangerous, submerged sexual subversion.
I mean, my God, weren't they unleashed? Bloody hell.
It was this they believed had happened in Russia. To many, this...
I didn't know that Freud got so blackpilled, by the way. That is kind of interesting.
Well, I think it's good, as we've said before, these are great jumping off points, these documentaries, to look a bit further. It's often, I think, been a kind of commonplace of culture, maybe even on the right in the last sort of 10, 20 years, to just say, well, we just dismiss Freud in some way. But as you say, I think he touches upon certain key engines of action that have to be looked at and understood, and somehow you have to reappraise the idea that he's the kind of sort of the progenitor of this kind of decline that we're on. There's something conflicted about him that's interesting, and Curtis is bringing this out.
Yeah, I'm also reminded, man delights me not. Who said that? It's from that was from Hamlet, wasn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Interesting.
That one of the guiding principles of mass democracy was wrong. The belief that human beings could be trusted to make decisions on a rational basis. The leading political writer, Walter Lippmann, argued that if human beings were in reality driven by unconscious, irrational forces, then it was necessary to rethink democracy. What was needed was a new elite who could manage what he called the bewildered herd. This would be done through psychological techniques that would control the unconscious feelings of the masses.
So here you have...
See, what's dark, Simon, is that I basically agree with that. And it took me many, many years to accept it. Again, so I didn't want to, as a younger man, I didn't want to accept it.
Yes.
But over many years, I have come to accept it.
We want to believe we're flexible and malleable enough internally to incorporate all kinds of things which run counter to the nature that we inhabit. And one of the realizations that's terrible is that actually, yes, you very often are surrounded by people who are not going to be capable of actualizing, Trumpton, so to speak.
I think the final, I mean, I'd been on that trajectory for many years already, especially after reading Kahneman and Haidt, and it's almost impossible not to think, yeah, probably people do need to be guided, and Carlyle got me a long way there as well. Somebody needs to steer the ship. People need guidance, moral guidance. They actually yearn to be guided, right?
Yes.
If you read Le Bon. But the thing that really got me over the line was COVID. Just living through COVID, I was just, yes, the people are cattle. They really are.
Yeah. It's as you said before, that people arrive at political positions often through an emotional position that then has to be, if you like, made respectable by some sort of discourse. But what happens here is Lippmann essentially is saying, in Freudian terms, there's a sort of unresolved id, this sort of spontaneous, childlike force that is this sort of reservoir of pure emotion. And what we find from this documentary is that they give that id the sort of dominant role in people's lives, but it needs to be also supplied and controlled by the superego, the parental part of the personality. So essentially, he's kind of taking a bit of Freud's model, and it's sort of broken in a way, because Freud, I suppose, essentially is talking about the development of the human moving away from the father figure, the superego, and becoming independent and supplanting the father. But this is a different model. This is a sort of slightly corrupted version of it, in which, well, we can't really trust people to have a fully executive ego, where they run themselves. They will just kind of need to have a simulated ego where they think they're self-actualizing. Their childlike part is driving their desires, but actually we need to instill a parental part of them, the superego, that will maintain order, because we don't really trust them. They're not reliable.
We want you, big brother.
Yeah,
big brother.
He learns to love Big Brother.
Yeah. Someone to guide us. All right, let's carry on.
Walter Lippmann, probably the most influential political thinker in the United States, who is essentially saying that the basic mechanism of the mass mind is unreason, is irrationality, is animality. He believes that the mob in the street, which is how he sees ordinary people, are people who are driven not by their minds but by their spinal cords. The notion of kind of animal drives, unconscious instinctual drives lurking beneath the surface of civilization. And so they started looking towards psychological science as a way of understanding the mechanisms by which the popular mind works.
Sorry to pause this again. These beliefs about the nature of the crowd and the nature of the mob are not new to these people here. They are rediscovering them, if you want. This was basically the view of Plato and Aristotle. It was basically the view of all of the Roman, Cicero and people like that. It was the view of Shakespeare, right? Yes. I mean, the idea that it is somehow, quote, Talmudic or something to think in this way is, I'm afraid, wrong. This is how the crowd was always thought of, and why historically democracy was just de facto seen as stupid, like literally stupid. And all that's happening is that a few smart people around this time, like Lippmann and Bernays and so on, are just be figuring out, like, yeah, this is a fucking stupid system. Somebody needs to have their if we don't guide it, somebody else is going to do it, basically.
And again, we have to think about it in the aggregate, not the individual, because we're not saying, from, let's say, the point of view of reaction, that the individual won't be able to control their life as such. But in the aggregate, individuals en masse, in a sense, don't govern and self-actualize themselves in a kind of complementary and harmonious way. So there has to be a form of power, and democracy attempts to distribute that power. But then we see that the objectives and aims that people want to achieve through democracy fail to be realized because of that. And it's one of those commonplaces that say, well, democracy is great, but dictatorship is faster.
Yeah. I mean, also, like, because people don't kill the liberal within themselves, right? So I can imagine people in the chat saying things like, "Oh yeah, but they want to control you as well." I'm like, yeah, that's true. But also, I mean, I often think, Simon, that our generation, in some strange way, was denied a lot of moral guidance.
Yes.
There was too much liberalism when we were growing up.
Yes.
There wasn't enough of a guiding hand.
That's right. Yeah, it was very much on the wane. It was the real fag end of things. I mean, for me, I was born in 1971, and the closest thing to that was, you may have learned hymns at school. We did learn hymns at school, and there was always the memory of the war as a kind of instructing or guiding myth. But very much an old world overlooming your life, from which you sort of worked out what the moral guidance was in a way, but it had ceased to be inhabited or vital in any sense, and so it was just it was an echo of what had been. I mean,
essentially outsourced to Coca-Cola.
Yeah,
I mean, literally,
Yeah.
So anyway, let's carry on. I mean, if anybody gave me moral guidance, it was probably like He-Man. Like, literally, do you remember those little little sermons He-Man would do at the end?
Yeah,
don't talk to strangers, kids.
Yeah, but we could laugh at pop culture, but in a sense, those are the kind of last vestiges of the message, if you like, being implanted at some level by someone trying to pass on some sort of instruction, and even if it ends up in a Batman comic or whatever.
I mean, if you're interested, by the way, why He-Man had those moral messages at the end of it, I think it was the Reagan administration that insisted that there had to be a moral message at the end of children's cartoons, that it couldn't just be nihilistic. So, and there was a psychologist who was attached to every. I mean, if you look at the end credits of He-Man, you'll see that there's a child psychologist involved. Yeah. And they were basically tasked by the government to ensure that every single thing that American kids watched had some sort of affirming moral guidance at the end of it. That was one of the few good things that Reagan did, arguably.
And that was a reaction to things that had really happened earlier in the 50s. You may recall that book I recommended to you, Welcome to Mars, by Ken Hollings. He has an interesting section in there on a guy called Frederick Wertham, who was, I think, a psychoanalyst, who looked at things like the Batman comics back in the 50s and remarked upon there were elements of, if you like, subversion. He has got quite an interesting passage on a sort of, the atmosphere between Batman and Robin is kind of sort of homoerotic in some way. And, the villains, as these sort of, these ravening women villains, but, they ultimately get defeated by the masculine duo. And Wertham was noticing these things at that time. And this was leading to the sort of countercultural expression, whereby these sort of relationships between the heroic elements began to be sort of compromised in some way, and that sort of led to the sort of efflorescence of subversion in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, very interesting stuff. It was, and let's be fair, Batman and Robin were pretty homoerotic in those 50s comics.
Sure. but it's what you take from it ultimately that matters, and it's kind of it's open to readings, as we might say,
specifically with the goal of figuring out how to understand how to apply those mechanisms to strategies for social control.
Edward Bernays was fascinated by Lippmann's arguments and also saw a way to promote himself by using them. In the 1920s, he began to write a series of books which argued that he had developed the very techniques Lippmann was calling for. By stimulating people's inner desires and then sating them with consumer products, he was creating a new way to manage the irrational force of the masses. He called it the engineering of consent.
Democracy, to my father, was a wonderful concept, but I don't think he felt that all those publics out there had reliable judgment.
I mean, some of Bernays' turns of phrases, if you actually read him, are remarkable, by the way. Where, I mean, he's got this other book, because I think it's called something like Crystallizing Public Opinion or something like that. He's got this whole passage on polls, right? And on public, when politicians talk about like a law they want to make, but they don't want to do it because the majority of the public opposes it. And he's like, this is a failure of imagination. I will personally change all of their minds and they will vote for it. And we'll produce a poll that says they support it anyway, and then we'll make it true. And like the way he just lays it all out is just remarkable. I mean, it's much like my admiration of Blair as a doctor of evil, Simon. I have the mixture of kind of, love and hate for Bernays. The evil part of me admires his just ability to see all of this and do all of this. Yeah,
absolutely.
But remember, for darkness,
and that they very easily might vote for the wrong man or want the wrong thing, so that they had to be guided from above. It's enlightened despotism in a sense.
But you see, this is the thing. Enlightened despotism is actually the only choice. The belief it could be otherwise is wrong. So from this point of view, Bernays is actually correct. It's just that we may disagree with what his version of enlightenment was. Right. But still, what you'd actually want is an enlightened despotism.
Yeah. The problem for us comes because what Bernays does is it's, if you like, product becomes sacramentalized and elevated. It's a kind of, Bernays creates, I mean, apologies to any Catholic bros listening, but he creates this idea of a sort of transubstantiation through the material economy, that the product represents your dream, that it represents your desire. And that appeal bypasses traditional religious cosmologies at the center of a society. And essentially it puts product powerfully at the center of the mythic and sacred. And it sounds like a deeply heretical kind of idea, but that's part of what Bernays leans on, and part of what gets us to this time of, inner corrosion of the soul. And
yeah, I mean,
through materiality.
One of the central political themes of our time, Simon, is identity, right? Identity. But how many people are like those Star Wars bros that you see on YouTube? Where they've got they've got the bedroom full of the toys, they've got the Star Wars T-shirt, they've got the, I certainly had times in my life where I was defined by my record collection or, what films I liked and so on. So we've all lived through this moment because that is the only identity that this type of society allows you in a way.
Yeah,
it hasn't really allowed anything else. And
go on. Product becomes identity, and vice versa. That's again part of this idea of communicative capitalism. These things are interchangeable as long as there is this stimulus response loop. But I mean, it's understandable that he's about to talk about the stock market crash, and it's interesting that this idea gains traction at a time where the economy does cease to have this central reliability, and underwrite what Foucault calls a society of discipline, where you have these senses of duty, and you're honor bound to organizations and societies and sets of behaviors that are kind of, if you like, instilled and then followed. And that's completely exploded.
You're talking about Catholicism and me talking about Star Wars. I also had the idea, as I was talking as we were talking just now, you know, if you think about the congregation going to the cinema, and instead of communion, you've got the you know, the moment where the Star Wars titles come up,
Yes.
and then
yes.
the John S. Williams music comes in.
Yeah.
I mean, it is probably like the closest thing to a religious experience that. I mean, I remember going to watch The Force Awakens with a group of guys, and I mean, when that started, when it was a new Star Wars after a decade of no Star Wars,
Yeah.
there was a kind of quasi-religious thing, and like there were people who were like
Oh.
visibly emotional watching it, you know, and there is something to that, you know.
It was phenomenally powerful as a sort of cultural, you know, moment. Actually, I mean, I saw it originally in the cinema in '77, and there was that kind of intensity about it. I mean, you heard the stories later on in America where they would show it to the sort of the geeks then, and you know, as soon as the Star Destroyer sort of looms over the screen and seems to go on forever, there's this cheering that breaks out and this whooping, and you know, there's this sort of orgasmic moment that people have. But this is all fascinating because, you know, again, talking in Freud's terms, this is all. I mean, you know, Bernays is working with movie stars. He's literally working in the frame of projection, and this is a Freudian notion as well. That the bits of reality you cannot incorporate into your own personal map of the world end up as projections, and they can be neurotic projections, but they can be sort of aspirational projections, if you like, as well. And that's the, you know, Bernays is working on the canvas of the subconscious, the movie screen of the subconscious, and that's, you know, that all ties into those kinds of intense moments of feeling that, as you say, is sort of quasi-religious. Because you've internalized that sacrament of the product or the idea or the force of that message. I mean, literally calling it the force. You know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
You appeal to their desires and their unrecognized longings, that sort of thing. That you can tap into their deepest desires or their deepest fears and use that to your own purposes.
And then, in 1928, a president came to power who agreed with Bernays. President Hoover was the first politician to articulate the idea that consumerism had become the central motor of American life. After his election, he told a group of advertisers and public relations men, "You have taken over the job of creating desire and have transformed people into constantly moving happiness machines. Machines which have become the key to economic progress." What was beginning to emerge in the 1920s was a new idea of how to run mass democracy. At its heart was the consuming self, which not only made the economy work, but was happy and docile, and so created a stable society.
Both Bernays and Littman's concept of managing the masses takes the idea of democracy and it turns it into a palliative. It turns it into giving people some kind of feel-good medication that will respond to an immediate pain or an immediate yearning, but will not alter the objective circumstances one iota. I mean, democracy really, the idea of democracy at its heart was about changing the relations of power that had governed the world for so long. And Bernays' concept of democracy was one of maintaining the relations of power, even if it meant that one needed to sort of stimulate the psychological lives of the public. And in fact, in his mind, that was what was necessary.
And I just want to pause it there because it does strike me that, especially in the American presidential case, so much of the MAGA movement has been about dopamine hits, Simon, and also the Democrats. I mean, you know, all that stuff about drinking lid tears, right?
Yeah.
But also all the stuff about owning the chuds. You know, the Democrats also love to drink MAGA tears, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of like poning the opposition, but it's all symbolic. It's all bollocks, basically. I mean,
yeah.
Nobody ever gets, like, nothing actually changes. It is just purely in the mind. It is just like the, you know, a kind of a dopamine, a happiness engine, like he called it, you know.
Yeah.
All symbolic. let's carry on.
That if you can keep stimulating the irrational self, then leadership can basically go on doing what it wants to do.
Bernays now became one of the central figures in a business elite that dominated American society and politics in the 1920s. He also became extremely rich and lived in a suite of rooms in one of New York's most expensive hotels, where he gave frequent parties.
Oh my goodness. He had a home in the corner suite of the Sherry Netherland Hotel. And here's this wonderful suite with all these windows looking out on Central Park and across at the plaza and on the square. And he would use this place to hold a soiree. The mayor would come. All the media leaders would come, the political leaders, the business leaders, the people in the arts. I mean, it was a who's who. People wanted to know Eddie Bernays because, you know, he himself became a sort of a famous man, a sort of a magician who could make these things happen.
He knows everybody. He knows the mayor and he knows the senator, and he calls politicians on the telephone as if he did get literally a high or a bang out of doing what he did. And that's fine, but it can be a little hard on the people around you, especially when you make other people feel stupid. People who worked for him were stupid, and children were stupid, and if people did things in a way that he wouldn't have done them, they were stupid. It was a word that he used over and over and over, dope and stupid.
I come back, Simon, to how Bernays would have thought about today's elites. If you could see the fucking state on them, you know.
Yeah.
And the masses?
They were stupid.
Was he wrong, though? That's the question. Was he wrong?
No, I don't think he ultimately was. Again, the masses as an aggregate force. You know, this is part of the problem of the discourse of much of what we have in, you know, what Scrump and Evelyn call the endless conversation. You know, the masses are very, very hard to reach, and to align with a project that might be in their own interest, but you can't do that. It's completely kept off from your ability to access that by these mechanisms of manipulating the unconscious.
But Bernays' power was about to be destroyed dramatically, and by a type of human irrationality he could do nothing to control. At the end of October 1929, Bernays organised a huge national event to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the invention of the light bulb. President Hoover, the leaders of major corporations, and bankers like John D. Rockefeller were all summoned by Bernays to celebrate the power of American business. But even as they gathered, news came through that shares on the New York Stock Exchange were beginning to fall catastrophically. Throughout the 1920s, speculators had borrowed billions of dollars. The banks had promoted the idea that this was a new era where market crashes were a thing of the past. But they were wrong. What was about to happen was the biggest stock market crash in history. Investors had panicked and begun to sell in a blind, relentless fury that no reassurance by bankers or politicians could halt. And on the 29th of October 1929, the market collapsed. The effect of the crash on the American economy was disastrous. Faced with recession and unemployment, millions of American workers stopped buying goods they didn't need. The consumer boom that Bernays had done so much to engineer disappeared, and he and the profession of public relations fell from favour. Bernays' brief moment of power seemed to be over. The effect of the Wall Street crash on Europe was also catastrophic. It intensified the growing economic and political crisis in the new democracies. In both Germany and Austria, there were violent street battles between the armed wings of different political parties.
The based and the commies, essentially.
Against this backdrop, Freud, who was suffering from cancer of the jaw, retreated yet again to the Alps. he wrote a book called Civilization and Its Discontents. It was a powerful attack on the idea that civilization was an expression of human progress. Instead, Freud argued, civilization had actually been constructed to control the dangerous animal forces inside human beings.
Again, a deep, tragic vision that is shared by many conservative thinkers, interestingly. I think Thomas Sowell talks, he's got a phrase somewhere where every generation of new children are born barbarians and they need to be civilized, basically. Otherwise they'll just become animals. This is very ingrained tragic vision sort of thinking.
And maintained by the pattern of power that you've described over centuries, that essentially the function of the ego, the executive function, just resides in a small elite, because that's the only awareness able to manage society under that vision.
Yes.
What was implicit in Freud's argument was that the ideal of individual freedom, which was at the heart of democracy, was impossible. Human beings could never be allowed to truly express themselves because it was too dangerous. They must always be controlled and would thus always be discontent.
Man doesn't want to be civilized, and he is civilization brings discontent, but it's necessary to survival. Otherwise he couldn't survive. So he must be discontent, because this would be the only way to keep him within limits.
But what did Freud think about the idea of the equality of man?
He didn't believe in it.
We had 32 parties, and Hitler said, before those parties don't vanish, there is no Germany. That's true. You can't have 32 parties. And so they felt, this one person will put an end to this comedy.
Freud was not alone in his pessimism. Politicians like Adolf Hitler emerged from a growing despair in the 1920s about democracy. The Nazis were convinced that democracy was dangerous because it unleashed a selfish individualism, but didn't have the means to control it.
Were they wrong, though? Were they wrong?
Hitler's party, the National Socialists, stood in elections, promising in their propaganda that they would abandon democracy because of the chaos and unemployment it led to.
Can you imagine somebody standing on a platform, Simon? If you elect me, I will literally end democracy. I mean, that's what they're accusing Trump of now. But,
tough sell.
It's elect me and I will end elections tomorrow. I reckon it might actually pick up steam if it was allowed.
Well, again, it's Bernays. It's talking about Freud here. It's responding to a kind of Freudian mechanism of somehow the child wants the strong father. I mean, it's no coincidence that in Nazi Germany it's referred to as the fatherland, as opposed to the motherland in the Soviet Union. It's a recrudescence of control with a certain amount of drive that happens in the politics of crisis, where someone needs to come in. We're going to see very shortly FDR, in a sense, fulfills the same thing coming from the Democrat side in America to assert a kind of father role.
FDR basically becomes a dictator for like 20 years.
Yeah,
in America.
He takes these executive powers that I wasn't aware that he stopped Americans owning gold privately.
Oh yeah.
And it didn't get changed back until 40 years later under Gerald Ford. So this thing of actually there is a yearning for the smack of firm government, as people say, and you bring back the tough father. I mean, do you remember all this stuff going around when Starmer was elected?
Yeah.
About he had this kind of daddy energy.
Jordan Peterson has talked about it, the strict father archetype.
Yeah,
strict father, he calls it. Yeah. Somebody to tell you to clean your room. Up yours, woke Morris. Sorry.
Die Parteien versprachen den Himmel auf Erden.
March 1933, the National Socialists were elected to power in Germany, and they set out to create a society that would control human beings in a different way. One of their first acts was to take control of business. The planning of production would in future be done by the state. The free market was too unstable, as the crash in America had proved.
Belief shared by every Western politician since 1945 as well. I should note, including FDR, by the way. And this is the great insight of James Burnham, which is that Germany, USSR, and America of this period were three different types of managerial states who all, in their various different ways, had a command and control economy. Yeah. So, yeah, just worth reiterating whenever I can.
Workers' leisure time was also planned by the state through a new organisation called Strength Through Joy. One of its mottos was service, not self. But the Nazis did not see this as a return to an old form of autocratic control. It was a new alternative to democracy, in which the feelings and the desires of the masses would still be central, but they would be channeled in such a way as to bind the nation together. The chief exponent of this was Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda.
Can I just say, Simon, what's really interesting here is that we've had a few minutes now on the mid-century Germans from Curtis with no moral fagging so far. I mean, I'm guessing there'll be some coming, but I mean, this is like a long, uninterrupted moment where he's speaking relatively value-free terms about the Germans. Which you wouldn't. Would you see that now? I mean, I can't remember the last time I've ever seen it.
No, not at all. You couldn't have a sort of dispassionate exploration of it, without certain pervasive epistemes hanging above your head.
Interesting. I mean, people are saying 2002 was a different time. I mean, if anything, it was the peak of it. The 90s were the peak of, movies by Steven Spielberg, and it was incessant during this period. So I don't know. I think this is kind of interesting. That I'm guessing that there's going to be some point soon, but
it's going to describe a Freudian mechanism in a moment, which will be interesting to talk about. But also, it's in itself just, as you say, nice to have a sort of an exploration which is not rooted in a hysteria. It's just looking at the mechanics of regimes, and that's what I find really interesting about this stuff. And as you say, the contrast with the American regime to come also is what makes these things intriguing in Curtis.
Yeah, just two different variants of essentially the same thing.
Yeah, people just essentially trying to solve a certain kind of problem, and how they go about it. People create the value judgments. Yes, certainly, you're free to do so. But interesting.
Es mag gut sein, Macht zu besitzen, die auf Gewehren ruht. Besser aber und beglückender ist es, das Herz eines Volkes zu gewinnen und es auch zu behalten.
And look, he actually subtitled a Goebbels speech as well.
Pure Machiavellian reasoning as well. Although it's better to be feared, the prince wants to be loved, and they understand that you can't exercise power by cruelty alone. Which is why I think you've talked about this period of history, whether it's the Soviet Union or mid-century Germany, the lives within those nations as they are lived are not necessarily the unbearable hells that are described to us now. There's obviously got to be a situation within these regimes which makes life livable, and that it's not entirely some sort of degraded hellscape that it's made out to be. It must work at some level, even if those outcomes may be later judged to be horrific, let's say.
I bet you anything, life in mid-century Germany was probably more pleasant than modern day Southport, for example, or Swindon now.
I always remember John Cleese's psychiatrist, Robin Skinner, in one of his books, talked about, would you rather live in Nazi Germany or Mogadishu in the early 90s, where people were riding around on Toyota trucks with a machine gun on the back, just blowing away anybody they fancied, and the society had collapsed. We'd rather live in Nazi Germany.
Yeah, very, very interesting stuff. I also appreciate the way he has correctly picked out Goebbels as a counterpart to Bernays.
Yes.
Like this is, this was their regime's Bernays, Goebbels, because that is, as far as I can tell, everything I've read, and I've got various different books, that was true. That Goebbels, and he was a very similar personality type, which is not very personable, not very liked by people kind of on a one-to-one basis, but he had a great understanding of crowd psychology and of propaganda and of these sorts of techniques. So he was seen as indispensable to Hitler, but he was not well liked by the other high command or by the men either. So,
and Bernays did confirm in his autobiography in 1965 that Goebbels did read his books.
Very, very interesting.
Goebbels organised huge rallies whose function, he said, was to forge the mind of the nation into a unity of thinking, feeling and desire. One of his inspirations, he told an American journalist, was the writings of Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays. In his work on crowd psychology, Freud had described how the frightening irrationality inside human beings could emerge in such groups. The deep, what he called libidinal forces of desire, are given up to the leader, while the aggressive instincts are unleashed on those outside the group. Freud wrote this as a warning, but the Nazis were deliberately encouraging these forces because they believed they could master and control them.
Do you know what I always find fascinating about this, Simon? Sorry to keep on interrupting.
No, I'm interested.
Is how quickly the mid-century Germans were able to do that.
Yes.
Right. I mean, from 1933 onwards, they managed to get that up and running in a spectacularly short amount of time, which means that they must have been pulling on strings that were already there in some way.
Yes.
Like the idea that they just overnight brainwashed the population cannot be true. They must have triggered something that was already there at a deep level. And, they lent into, there's that book, the Myth of Violence by George Sorel, which talks about this. They're deliberately leaning into these things, as Curtis is saying, but they did it. Like, they were phenomenally successful, like straight off the bat. I mean, try organizing a crowd that size.
Yeah.
And you can tell it's not done by machine gun. You can tell it's not coerced, that they, there was a huge amount of people there who were genuinely believing what was happening, or they're caught up in the moment.
Yeah. Employing powerful sort of mythic resonances in order to do that. And again, in Freud's terms, these mechanisms that Curtis describes there, he's describing what Freud would call paranoid projection, that there is the out group that is left off the map of reality, as the story goes, as a significant driver. But also, there is also this idea of the libidinal force. There's a very interesting documentary by the art historian Robert Hughes. It was called Visions of Space, and it was about the architect Albert Speer, and how during the war Hitler and Speer reconceived of Berlin, because they hated Berlin. It was the Bohemian city. It was corrupted, degraded. It was gay race communism, and they decided that after the war they would rebuild Berlin and efface it with this new city called Germania. And Speer had this concept: at the center of Germania would be this massive dome, like the Albert Hall, but much, much, much bigger. And again, Robert Hughes comments that it's literally shaped like a large breast in a way, this kind of dome. So the idea is to sort of harness these libidinal energies. And he asks Speer, what did you want people to feel when they were inside this monumental, vast structure, this structure that would be so big that it would have its own microclimate. People's breath would actually form small clouds up in the high vaults, and it would fall as very light rain. And he said to Speer, what did you want people to feel? And Speer said, I wanted them to feel nothing. I wanted them to feel completely subsumed to the vision. So there was this powerful effacement of the individual, and this capture through, you know, this again, it's this Freudian mechanism, the strict father, but instead of in Freud's Oedipus, the father is there to be attacked and subverted. All of that hatred is directed outside of the building, so to speak. And this is, again, the conventional reading of Germany at the time.
That's fascinating stuff. Fascinating.
Well, Freud was saying that masses are bound by libidinal forces. They love each other and delegate their ideas and their feelings to the chap on top.
What are libidinal forces? What are libidinal forces?
Well, forces of love.
Not hate.
No, hate is delegated to the others outside. It's the mob.
I could see from afar, looking up Wilhelmstraße towards Unter den Linden, how those 100,000 of people, when they passed Hitler, they just became completely delirious. They began to shout these cries I will never get out of my ears. Heil, Sieg, Heil. They demented. And here I got confirmation how those irrational forces, uncontrollable forces in Germany, in the Germans, had erupted, had broken out, were running riot, were departing, marching on.
Where does Curtis find these characters? What a marvelous interview that was. I have to say, by the way, I have always had a pathological fear of the crowd. You know, right back when I first saw the first images of the French Revolution, and watching these images, I do find them a bit scary personally. Not because it's the mid-century Germans, just because I hate crowds, and I always have done. You know, there's something, I don't know. I'm not a man of the crowd myself. I hate to be in crowds. I always remember going to New Year's Eve in London. Have you ever done that? Everybody has to do it a couple of times, right?
Oh, gosh,
and the blind of baying horde trying to get back into the. Oh, it's just. I mean, I'd rather die than try to do that stuff again. And as I've got older, I've become even more disdainful of the crowd. So, you know, I prefer to look at these things from a distance, long way away, not being in it myself.
And there is something. I mean, yours is. It's the classic, you know, reactionary disdain for the mob, I suppose, as well. There's an element of that could be there, but there's an animalistic thing that happens within crowds. I remember I was at the Notting Hill Carnival this must have been years ago, mainly out of a sort of curiosity to see what it was about, and it was a really packed year, and we were in these streets around Notting Hill. And it was just absolutely, I've never seen a place more jammed full of people. You could barely move. And at some point, a crush developed in the crowd. People were getting squashed against buildings. And it's the only time I've ever felt it, but there was a wave of fear that went through everybody, because it felt, gee, this is how Hillsborough happened. This is actually very dangerous. You don't think, you think you'll be fine. You'll just, you know, duck down or something. You literally cannot move. And you can feel people crushing against you in a huge wave. And there's a terror that was completely animalistic. It was a fraction of a second, but you could feel it rippling like an animal through a crowd. It was very weird.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably close to my Room 101 or something like that. I just can't. There's something about the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people in the same place. I used to have a reoccurring nightmare where there was Mary Antoinette sitting on my bed, trying to get away from the mob. You know, this was when I was 7 or 8. I was probably watching things I shouldn't have been watching, like Baron Munchausen and stuff like that. But you know, it's kind of quite deep seated in me. So you know, I can admire this from afar or not admire it from afar, but I would not like to be in that crowd there, carrying a torch or part of it. I wouldn't want to be standing on the stage in front of them either at all. So, yeah.
And in America too, democracy was under threat from the force of the angry mob. The effect of the stock market crash had been disastrous. There was growing violence as an angry population took out their frustration on the corporations who were seen to have caused this disaster.
If only they succeeded.
Could have been so much different.
Then, in 1932, a new president was elected who was also going to use the power of the state to control the free market. But his aim was not to destroy democracy, but to strengthen it. And to do this, he was going to develop a new way of dealing with the masses.
I am prepared, under my constitutional duty, to recommend the measures that a stricken nation in the midst of a stricken world may require. But in the event that the national emergency is still critical, I shall not evade the clear course of duty that will then confront me. I shall ask the Congress for...
Sorry for pausing it again. I just want to give my admiration for 1930s Chicago gangster chic on full display here. Kind of like these guys that call things like Bugsy and
Fingers.
Fingers, yeah. Hey, this Louis 2 bits down there and things like that.
Happy birthday, Bugsy. Boom, boom, boom.
Yeah, exactly.
remaining instrument to meet the crisis. Broad executive power.
Executive power.
Yeah.
It was the start of what would become known as the New Deal. Roosevelt assembled a group of young technocrats and planners in Washington. He told them that their job was to plan and run giant new industrial projects for the good of the nation. Roosevelt was convinced that the stock market crash had shown that laissez-faire capitalism could no longer run modern industrial economies.
Just to pause this here
for a second. It become the job of government.
Just a brief comment. You see how Curtis is coding this as an optimistic vision. The music becomes instantly sort of romantic and sweeping, kind of feeling that, well, this is a great thing. It starts full of optimism, but I mean, it is intensely controlling. When I read about Roosevelt today, I mean, it's 40 years since we talked about the New Deal when I was at school, but I remember things like the alphabet agencies that had proliferated under Roosevelt. But he had a very Blairite streak, didn't he? He rather bypassed cabinet government.
Oh, very much so. Basically a dictator. In fact, Curtis Yarvin is somebody who's written very eloquently on exactly this topic, about the various different Caesars in America's history, and he's got a great essay on FDR as a kind of an American Caesar. Also, whenever there's any optimism in a Curtis documentary, you know that this was a fantasy is coming at some point, right? So, wondering when he starts to undercut the optimism here.
Big business was horrified, but the New Deal attracted the admiration of the Nazis, especially Joseph Goebbels.
Wir betrachten die wirtschaftliche Entwicklung in Amerika mit dem allergrößten positiven Interesse. Und wir sind dort der festen Überzeugung, dass Präsident Roosevelt und seine Berater auf dem richtigen Wege sind. Es handelt sich in der Tat um das größte wirtschaftliche und soziale Problem aller Zeiten. Die vielen Millionen Arbeitslosen, die ihre Plätze an den Maschinen und in den Kontoren verloren haben, wieder an ihre alten Arbeitsstellen zurückzuführen.
You know, watching this footage, Simon, I long for a neutral Adam Curtis documentary using this archival footage, because it's almost never the case that you see these guys talk without some kind of thudding BBC school mom coming up saying, "Oh, don't forget though, they were evil," and all that. And he just hasn't done that in this documentary. And it's kind of, it's very refreshing actually to see Goebbels speaking like uncensored, subtitles, just explaining what was happening, treating them as the government of Germany. I mean, this is very novel.
Exactly. I mean, I always remember being very struck by this footage that he's there kind of, in mufti, in civilian clothing, just sort of chatting as, you'd find on a sort of YouTube video today of, Peter Hitchens and Owen Jones chatting on a park bench, and it's just explaining, we're looking, it's this, the idea of Germany as a sort of isolated, inward-looking place, and yet you've got Goebbels saying, well, we kind of approve of what President Roosevelt is doing here, and I suppose you're also reminded of the fact, I think, was it the Bund in America, the National Socialist Sympathetic formation, sort of had certain purchase at this time as well, and there was this obviously this American suspicion of entering into a war situation again, and so there was this regard for time.
Curtis devoted a whole episode of Oceans Apart to that, where who was the Charles Lindbergh, Charles Lindbergh and the anti-war effort and so on. So obviously something that he has great knowledge of, but it's just seeing the archival footage though, uncensored in a way, kind of remarkable.
Das kann nicht allein der privaten Initiative überlassen werden. Ausschlaggebend ist, dass die öffentliche Hand mit positiven Maßnahmen eingreift.
But although Roosevelt, like the Nazis, was trying to organize society in a different way, unlike the Nazis, he believed that human beings were rational and could be trusted to take an active part in government. Roosevelt believed it was possible to explain his policies to ordinary Americans and take into account their opinions. To do this, he was helped by the new ideas of an American social scientist called George Gallup.
Favorite reading of New Deal Washington, the survey of U.S. public opinion. From offices at Princeton, New Jersey, a famed statistician, Dr. George Gallup, tells Washington from week to week what the nation is thinking. And in New York, Fortune magazine's analyst, Elmo Roper, compiles for publication a continuous record of the nation's approval or disapproval of how the country is being run.
Gallup and Roper rejected Bernays' view that human beings were at the mercy of unconscious forces and so needed to be controlled. Their system of opinion polling was based on the idea that people could be trusted to know what they wanted. They argued that one could measure and predict the opinions and behaviour of the public if one asked strictly factual questions and avoided manipulating their emotions.
Can't see Eddie liking that, Simon.
No.
Well, how about this one? Do you think Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal has been bad for the nation in general?
No, that question's loaded. It automatically suggests an answer. Well, how about this? Is your present feeling toward President Roosevelt one of general approval or general disapproval? That's better.
Prior to scientific polling, the view of many people was that you couldn't trust public opinion. It was irrational, that it was ill-informed, chaotic, unruly, and so forth. And so that opinion should be dismissed. But with scientific polling, I think it established very clearly that people are rational, that they do make good decisions, and this offers democracy a chance to be truly informed by the public, giving everybody a voice in the way the country is run. I know my father wouldn't necessarily say the voice of the public is the voice of God, but he did feel very much that the voice of the people is a rational voice and should be heard.
Can we pause there?
What Roosevelt was doing.
Just to say, this is, for me, it's kind of like the birth of this sort of scientistic approach that, we still kind of suffer from. This, it's almost like an attempt to return to a kind of 19th century, the businessman and his ledger and the facts and figures annotated in a proper way, and everything is talked about as scientific polling. But I mean, I think Curtis is going a little bit light on this notion that it's an impartial frame, because the frame of impartiality is still a frame, and that's something to bear in mind when they talk about scientific polling, which he seems very emphatic about.
Yeah, I also wonder if there is, and I hate to bring this up, but I think it is relevant, an ethnic component to this.
Ah, yes.
Because it strikes me that George Gallup is, and this is the two sides of the ruling class, right? The kind of Anglo-Saxon side of the ruling class is always drawn to the neutral, scientific, utilitarian frame. Whereas the Edward Bernays side is always drawn to the mind game. It's like they've got two. It's like they master in different schools of magic. Simon.
Yes, it's very much like the Protestant vision, isn't it? It's like I talked earlier about this sort of industrial factualism. You know, it's like the Gradgrind character in which Dickens novel is it? Is it Bleak House? No, it's not Bleak House. Hard Times or something, I don't know. But the Gradgrind teacher character who's kind of full of, you know, lists of facts and so on, and very much like Robinson Crusoe, you know, the sort of the lists of provisions and the arrangements that are made. The Protestant sort of business mind loves this kind of approach because it seems to neutralize the personal.
Yes, stick to the stick to the science. And I still think this persists, by the way, in the various different ruling elites today, right? A significant part of the Davos crowd is very truly technocratic in this way, where they want kind of, they want these kind of measures of efficiency. There was a bit of it in the Blair and Brown government as well.
Yes,
as Curtis will go on to talk about.
Bludgeoned with data.
Yeah. Interesting. Very interesting.
Was forging a new connection between the masses and politicians. No longer were they irrational consumers who were managed by sating their desires. Instead, they were sensible citizens who could take part in the governing of the country. In 1936, Roosevelt stood for re-election. He promised further control over big business. To the corporations, it was the beginning of a dictatorship.
Roosevelt interferes with private enterprise and is running the country into debt for generations to come. The way to get recovery is to let business alone.
But Roosevelt was triumphantly re-elected.
It looks, my friends, like a real landslide this time. So please let me thank you again and tell you that I hope to see you all very soon and bid you an affectionate good night.
Faced with this, business now decided to fight back, to regain power in America. At the heart of the battle would be Edward Bernays and the profession he had invented, public relations.
Following that election, business people start to get together and start to carry on discussions, primarily in private, and they start talking to each other about the need to sort of carry on ideological warfare against the New Deal and to sort of reassert the sort of connectedness between the idea of democracy on the one hand and the idea of privately owned business on the other. And so, under the umbrella of an organization which still exists, which is called the National Association of Manufacturers, and whose membership included all of the major corporations of the United States, a campaign is launched explicitly designed to create emotional attachments between the public and big business. It's Bernays' techniques being used on a grand scale. I mean, totally.
General Motors Parade of Progress, traveling the high roads and byroads of America, bringing to millions of Americans in their own hometown the fascinating story behind modern industry, showing...
The campaign set out to show dramatically that it was business, not politicians, who had created modern America.
A better mode of living for all of us.
Bernays was an advisor to General Motors, but he was no longer alone. The industry he had founded now flourished as hundreds of public relations advisors organized a vast campaign. They not only used advertisements and billboards, but managed to insinuate their message into the editorial pages of the newspapers. It became a bitter fight. In response to the campaign, the government made films that warned of the unscrupulous manipulation of the press by big business. And the central villain was the new figure of the public relations man.
Okay, can I just say something which is often forgotten about? If you remember when we watched the Mayfair set, a large part of Curtis's thesis there was that power, political power, had no longer had the ability, that is, national governments no longer had the ability to stand up to big business. FDR, you could argue, was the last president who had the power to stand up to corporations, and he did so, as we're about to see. Yes. For good or for ill, right? I mean, libertarians may not like FDR for that reason, but he was, whatever else you want to say about him, he could actually take on big business because he had enough power. Whereas subsequent presidents, I don't think had that power anymore from Truman onwards. I would argue. But yeah, just worth remembering. Because it's clear that whether it's Trump or Biden or Kamala Harris, not one of them is going to stand up to big business, right? It's not like the Chinese government who can just shut down any company they want at any time. What if the US government wanted to take on Google, for example? Could they really do it? Google could bring down the internet tomorrow if they wanted to, you know? So it's that is, again, something that Curtis is very interested in, that he keeps on coming back to again and again.
They tried to achieve their ends by working entirely behind the scenes, corrupting and deceiving the public. The aims of such groups may be either good or...
I was just going to say, the sort of, the mustachioed PR guy there, just looking at how he's visually coded, he's meant to look a little bit like the big bad wolf, isn't he? The sweep of dark hair and the moustache and the broad shoulders. I'm just wondering if he's coded in any other way to represent any other kind of.
Well, it could literally be a cipher for Bernays himself.
Yeah.
Bad, so far as the public interest is concerned, but their methods are a grave danger to democratic institutions.
See his oily smile.
The films also showed how the responsible citizen could monitor the press themselves. They could create a chart that analysed the reporting for signs of hidden bias. But such earnest instruction was to be no match for the powerful imagination of Edward Bernays. He was about to help create a vision of the utopia that free market capitalism would build in America if it was unleashed. In 1939, New York hosted the World's Fair. Edward Bernays was a central advisor. He insisted that the theme be the link between democracy and American business. At the heart of the fair was a giant white dome that Bernays named Democracity. And the central exhibit was a vast working model of America's future, constructed by the General Motors Corporation.
To my father, the World's Fair was an opportunity to keep the status quo, that is, capitalism, in a democracy. Democracy and capitalism, that marriage, right, linking, just like that. He did that by manipulating people and getting them to think that you couldn't have real democracy in anything but a capitalist society, which was capable of doing anything, of creating these wonderful highways, of making, moving pictures inside everybody's house, of telephones that didn't need cords, of sleek roadsters. I mean, it was consumerist, but at the same time, you inferred that in a funny way, democracy and capitalism went together.
The World's Fair was an extraordinary success.
I just want to say a moment, Simon, that I find it easier to buy into these dreams these utopian visions from the mid-century, conjured by the likes of Bernays. Now, of course, we can objectively sit back and say, we can see the damage they've done, or they're bad, or
as
whatever.
Curtis would say, those dreams failed.
we know all of that. Yeah. But you can see, like, they are alluring, they are seductive. There is something. They're aesthetically, they're good. I like the aesthetics around them.
100%.
I mean, we grew up watching things like the Jetsons and things like that. And,
absolutely. Where are our flying cars, please?
And I do feel that the messaging today lacks that kind of the dreamscape. Disney had it as well, like the Epcot Center and all of that. That sense of wonder that America had is completely gone now. Completely gone.
This is really interesting, actually, because I mean that particular display at the World's Fair, the actual spherical building is actually called the Perisphere, and the big pointy needle is called the Trilon. And Democracy was an expo. This model, this huge, vast model, I think it was a guy called George Burgess who put it together. And the thing I noticed about this, rewatching this recently, was the shots of the model and the cars going along the highways and the sleek buildings and so on. Very reminiscent of those videos that Bukele has been putting out, where they're filmed from high up, from drone sort of footage. It's what you call a God eye view in cinematography terms, where you see these dynamic flows of cooperation and harmony. It's a very powerful way of visualizing the future with models and dioramas like this. And as you say, buying into this very appealing vision. And he uses that a lot in his videos. You've seen these ones where they're shifting prisoners around, and packing them neatly into these huge warehouses, or they're taking them out on work details. But they're filmed in a very similar way to the way you look at these models, these futurescapes, and it really captures the public imagination as a propaganda tool of its own.
Yeah, and interesting. You were talking about Speer's plans earlier, because there is a direct parallel with what was happening here and what was happening in Germany. Like they had their own, and in Russia, they had their own visions too. That movie Man with a Movie Camera that you can go and watch, and they were all kind of optimistic and hopeful and trying to build something which had a sense of grandeur and wonder about it.
And modernist architecture helped with that, and it had this scale, and also it had this kind of, I mean, Jonathan Bowden talked about this with Brutalism. They had these white buildings. It had this ethereality about it that was very alluring. The interesting thing about those two buildings, actually, Trilon and Perisphere at the World's Fair, the site is there, but those buildings were destroyed because they were mainly made of plaster. But the metal superstructure inside them was actually recycled into armaments for World War II. So the dreams go up in smoke.
Tragic. But this was a fantasy.
Exactly. And on the site today is a stainless steel sculpture, which is called the Unisphere, which is just a globe representing the world. There's no Trilon needle there. It's just the Unisphere.
I mean, I'd have loved to go onto the World Fair. This one, the 39 one, or any of them, because they've always just looked so amazing in the footage.
It's a shame none of this exists anymore. It was all just swept away, and there's very little footage out there other than what Curtis has in this documentary.
And captured America's imagination. The vision it portrayed was of a new form of democracy, in which business responded to people's innermost desires in a way politicians could never do. But it was a form of democracy that depended on treating people not as active citizens as Roosevelt did, but as passive consumers. Because this, Bernays believed, was the key to control in a mass democracy.
It's not that the people are in charge, but that the people's desires are in charge. The people are not in charge. The people exercise no decision-making power within this environment.
Based.
Yeah.
I mean, essentially true as well.
Yeah.
So democracy is reduced from something which assumes an active citizenry to the idea of the public as passive consumers. Driven primarily by instinctual or unconscious desires.
Not on the nose at all.
If you can, in fact, trigger those needs and desires, you can get what you want from them.
But this struggle between the two views of human beings as to whether they were rational or irrational was about to be dramatically affected by events in Europe. Events that would also change the fortunes of the Freud family. In March 1938, the Nazis annexed Austria. It was called the Anschluss. Hitler arrived in Vienna to an extraordinary outpouring of mass adulation. But even as he drove through the city, behind the scenes, the Nazis were systematically whipping up and unleashing the hatred of the crowd against the enemies of the new Greater Germany.
The Anschluss was a kind of explosion of terrible hatred against the enemies, the so-called.
I'll just mention there, Curtis basically gave the pro-German account of Anschluss there. I mean, he basically whitewashed out Anschluss for Hitler, which is bizarre. I've never seen it presented like that before.
It would be interesting to get him to talk about this documentary. There's very little out there. I've collected lots of interviews with Curtis, and there's very little where he talks about Century of the Self. It's interesting.
Very interesting, because it's usually presented as if Anschluss was forced on them, and they manipulated the polling. You know, they manipulated the votes, and not that the people wanted it. You know, so that is interesting.
Enemies, or whatever they considered enemies, against the Jews in totally. And also against a lot of very decent Austrians who had opposed the Nazis in Austria. They said it's legitimate, now you can do what you want, so they did it. Stealing, robbing and killing, I can't say it otherwise. And human depravity, of course, is always very near to normal behavior. It can change very quickly.
As the violence and assassinations raged in Vienna, Freud decided he had to leave. His aim was to go to Britain, but he knew that Britain, like many countries, was refusing entry to most Jewish refugees.
I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to say anything.
No comment.
But help came from the leading psychoanalyst in Britain, Ernest Jones. He was in the same ice skating club as the Home Secretary, Sir Samuel Hoare, and Jones persuaded Hoare to issue Freud a British work permit.
There it is, look, connections.
And in May 1938, Freud, his daughter Anna, and other members of his family set off for London. Freud arrived in London as Britain was preparing for war, and he settled with his daughter Anna in a house in Hampstead. But Freud's cancer was now far advanced, and in September...
So does that explain how Clement Freud ends up on that long-running panel show? What was it?
Yes. I know the one you mean.
Nicholas Parsons. Just a minute.
Just a minute. Well, he was a bit of a wrong on Clement Freud, apparently.
Well, yes.
As well as being a Lib Dem.
He was direct. If you listened, I got into Just a Minute at one point and started listening to all the, and he frequently mentioned, his grandfather, which was Sigmund Freud. So he brought her up possibly like every other episode. September
1939, just 3 weeks after the outbreak of war, he died. The Second World War would utterly transform the way governments saw democracy and the people they governed. Next week's programme will show how the American government, as a result of the war, became convinced there were savage, dangerous forces hidden inside all human beings, forces that needed to be controlled. The terrible evidence from the death camps seemed to show what happened when these forces were unleashed. And politicians and planners in post-war America would come to believe that hidden under the surface of their own population were the same dangerous forces. And they would turn to the Freud family to help control this enemy within.
It's dangerous territory for Adam Curtis to be getting into all this stuff, isn't it? It's kind of Very interesting.
Yeah.
And ever adaptable, Edward Bernays would work not just for the American government, but the CIA.
What could possibly go
And
wrong?
Sigmund Freud's daughter, Anna, would also become powerful in the United States because she believed that people could be taught to control the irrational forces within them. Out of this would come vast government programs to manage the inner psychological life of the masses.
Wow, what a good documentary that was, Simon.
Yes.
Where do you put this in the Curtis pantheon? It's got to be up there, isn't it?
It's difficult. It's like Kubrick films, isn't it? You know, you love all of them. They're all great, and it's difficult to pick a favorite one. So you just have to pick a random favorite one. I mean, my random favorite one's the Mayfair set, but this is pretty much up there, really. I think it's, as I say, it's more useful to internalize the lessons from this than many of the others, and it lays the foundations of what we talk about all the time, about persuasion, about propaganda. And the interesting thing about this is this revisitation of Freud. You know, he's this theorist of mind. You know, it's a theory of mind which is abstracted from collective or group forces that are defined by tradition and hierarchy and continuity, things that we might recognize as governing principles. And instead, it's about the unconscious mind, about dreams and Oedipal drives. And these become the substitute diagnostics for the state of man. And you see that reflected in government. That you have, I talked about earlier about Freud's division of the personality. And that, in a sense, that's what FDR does. In a sense, that's what Tony Blair does. Reading about FDR, he comes in as a tsunami of legislation. And he does this thing, as I say, of bypassing, you know, all the sort of usual consent mechanisms of government to devolve power in the way that Freud divides up the nature of man into these components. FDR does it with government. So executive decision-making power is sucked upwards, you know, into that sort of figure. But people are given this illusion of choice at the same time. You're stripping out the mechanism from the inside and leaving a sort of infantilized population that, you know, they do their little sort of spreadsheets of, you know, media bias like we were seeing there. It's faintly pathetic, and it doesn't have any influence on power. But the illusion has been created that you know, that product of desire has become the central part of your own cosmology as an individual. And that's what kicks off this whole arc from Curtis about the rise of radical individualism, its effects on our happiness, on our effectiveness as societies, which is what's interesting when you, as you say, we see the kind of uncompromised footage of mid-century Germany. We're just looking at what makes societies effective. Right. I mean, you know, it's interesting. It'll be interesting to see Curtis do this later on in the context of the Soviet Union as well. But, you know, what we end up with is with an infantilized individual. I mean, FDR strikes me also very similar as being in a way like the welfare state under Attlee that we got, you know, 12 years later.
Yeah, very much so, yeah.
You create the nurturing mother at the center, you know, but it takes power away from you. So effectively, in a sense, in Freud's terms, the superego, the parent, is in charge. And that accounts for a lot of the powerlessness that people feel now, because that is the nature of government.
Yeah, no, this is actually related to the mass society as well, something that Uncle Ted talks about, because if you're part of a mass population as opposed to the small village scale, you know, the few hundred people who live in your village versus the swarming horde, the biomass. You know, of course, the biomass needs to be managed using these kind of techniques of mass psychology and mass surveillance because of the scale of the thing. It actually wasn't necessary in the past to have all of this big machinery, simply because there weren't that many people. And this is something that the elite theorists talk about as well. You know, you know, from feudalism to increased centralization and increased bureaucratization as a result of complexity, essentially.
But it's fragmented and outsourced as well at the same time. And I mentioned Foucault's idea earlier of the societies of discipline. And on the modern left, for example, they'll talk about this philosopher Deleuze, who talks about the societies of control, in which we are now ensconced, where the control is that outsourced self-control that he's talking about. Anna Freud is trying to distribute in next week's episode. She's the sort of ultimate devouring mother, in a way, that sets up these mechanisms whereby people surveil themselves, and that's what leads to the kind of radical individualism of the sort of yippies and the hippies taking over.
And I mean, libertarians or people like my old friends at the Mises Institute and so on, who believe that you can have like an untrammeled capitalism that doesn't lead to this, I'm afraid are perhaps delusional, because the success of capitalism leads to the massive increase in the population, leads to the increased complexity, the mass society and so on, which then leads to the inevitability of the needs for these managerial techniques, right? Which is what Burnham talks about in Managerial Revolution. So they have this notion that you can actually have the mass society, free market capitalism without all of these controls in place, which is frankly just not delusional. Which is where you end up with people like Hans Hermann Hoppe actually looking for inspiration back in the feudal era, because it just so happens that the society they envision may work on the small scale of an individual town or village. But when you've got millions, billions of people now, you're going to end up with massive superstructures like the ones we've got. So,
and Curtis deals with this, I think, later on in his documentary, All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, where he talks about the Silicon Valley bros and the dream of self-organizing networks. And the reality is, they don't really self-organize. They just become these, as I say, these kind of circuits through which, stimulus response signals flow, but they don't organize in a political sense that we would recognize as being useful. But this is sort of allied to the libertarian notion that it'll all be okay if we just devolve the power, and the society will sort of hold itself together. Well, it doesn't seem to do that.
Just a couple of super chats before we get out of here. There's not that many, Simon. Chris Primer says, feeling stressed, try a torch of freedom. You don't hate freedom, do you? Barulaham, who's given out 50 gift memberships as well, very kind of him, says, evening friends, return of Deepest Law, what a delight. Any chance you can read and give your thoughts on my French-English tweet? If Simon Roberts can also give his opinion, that would be appreciated. Well, let me see if I can find that very quickly.
About that, please. Brulaham is turning into a bit of a Bernays style mass influencer with these memberships.
It's
great.
He says, well, he also was the man responsible for me being on the Duran, by badgering the Duran to get me on, and eventually they relented. So he says, on the French-English question, the Anglosphere's contemporary disdain for the French is, in actu, a post-1950s construction to placate any truly nationalist sentiment by the English. The goal is to keep the whole lot as vassal nations of America and its elite. Sensible centrists ought to be aware of this dynamic. It is understandable for Anglos to be wary of the French due to their long-standing history. However, the Anglos could look at France's pre-1990s distancing of the American elite as inspirational, something to emulate. There is no world in which this leads to the Gallicization of Britain. Rather, it could lead to a proper national identity for its people, couched in their long history and traditions, not in the American way as the only path forward. The casual dismissal or outright disdain thrown at Frenchmen is boomer truth regime, see my work on this, type propaganda. Go back to a Great Britain. English nations deserve their own future history, distinct from the American agenda. Multipolarity is, in the end, good for the West. Any thoughts on that, Simon?
I completely agree. I'm an English chauvinist, so I would.
Well, what do you think about the kind of reflexive, anti-French kind of? I often feel that people go in on that to have a bit of allowable bigotry. They know they can't go hard against like black people, for example, or against the you-know-whos. So they use the French as a kind of
permissible
substitute
mechanism. Yeah, it's very much, when we talk about Freudian mechanisms earlier, that mechanism I mentioned of paranoid projection, the classic illustration is the management of, if you like, nationalist sentiment by football in Britain. Our side's great, the other side are bad, and the ref is always bent. That's the sort of mindset of paranoid mechanism, a paranoid projection mechanism that is used as a sort of a key cultural governing trope. And so the French is, in a minor way, another one of those things. Well, at least we're not French, It's the permissible hatreds to deflect from the possibility of actual conflict.
It's safe, basically. Crispy GT, and people do get a genuine kick out of making fun of the French. Monty Python sketches, and
it's a laughter of release as well.
The Napoleonic Wars weren't that long ago, I suppose. But anyway, 100 Years' War. I mean, there's been a lot of Anglo-French wars, but and there's one way it plays into Boomer Truth, of course, is that you get to make fun of them for being surrender monkeys, cheese-eating surrender monkeys type thing, which makes Britain then, or British people then, feel good about themselves because they didn't surrender in World War II. They were not conquered,
That relates to there's a famous Czech poet called Česlav Miloš, who wrote a line, irony is the glory of slaves. It could also translate as irony is the language of slaves. But again, that sort of speaks to the thing of, we've talked about this in the sort of, especially in the Gen X context as well, the use of irony as a sort of deflective mechanism. And that sort of is one of those things that we do with some cultures as well, like the French, for example. We talk about, the surrender monkeys thing or something like that. And we tell ourselves, Britons never, never, never shall be slaves. It rings a bit hollow at certain points.
You got to remember, though, Henry V gave them an ass kicking.
Absolutely.
Napoleon got his arse handed to him. So there is a kind of they are like the permanent rival in a way through history, much more than the Germans, actually. In the long durée. And then somebody will remind you that the entire the Normans and William the Conqueror and so on, like the entire royal family is basically French. So Hibernian Perspective says, regarding your comments on Star Wars as a religious experience, I always thought the queues outside McDonald's after the first COVID lockdown here in Ireland were a kind of pseudo-religious ritual, stress alchemized into desire. The red mansard roof and the golden arches calling worshippers to prayer. Yes, absolutely. It's very odd, but these are actually the closest things people have to.
It's that, or queuing up at midnight for the latest iPhone in some shop in Oxford Street or something.
Look, Laura of Lycurgus says, in theaters it took 4 minutes for an expert filmer to rewind the tape. In between, a 4-minute man would propagandize for America's entry into World War One. So they'd rewind the tape, and while the guy was rewinding the tape, a bloke would come out and be like, "Yeah, support the war, everyone." No. In fact, in this country, David Lloyd George famously went down personally to the mines to personally persuade the miners to get involved in the war effort. And it worked too. Jacob Lowe says, World War II was the boomer generation's Roman Empire. Yeah, I mean, it really is ground zero. It really is ground zero. So, yes, that is it for the Super Chats. Simon, will you be back next week for part 2 of Century?
I hope so. I hope we get our 7.8K that we have to make now?
Yeah, it has to be 7,800 viewers for there to be a next one. Otherwise, Adam Curtis review will stop. Although every episode so far has made it easily. Most of them are over 20,000. So
yeah, we can't have rookie numbers. We've got to boost those numbers.
Got to boost those numbers, friends. Remember, promo code Scorcher, 25% off all courses. Buy the bundles. I am actually hoping, Simon, to do a bit more stuff on my AA Mellow channel. Maybe a few cigar reviews, something chill like that. With
AA radio would be good again.
I'll try to do something. I've been exceptionally busy the past couple of months, but I'm hoping I will get a bit more time. I'm sending AAA off to summer camp next week. Summer camp. So I'm going to have less parenting duties and more time to do fun stuff. I hope. But anyway, where can people find you, Simon?
At Simon__Roberts. And in the spirit of Sigmund Freud, as Pink Floyd say, come in here, dear boy, have a cigar. You're going to go far.
Thanks a lot for that. Remember, promo code Scorcher, 25% off. And I'll see you soon. Now get out.
Night.
What goes on in this town is none of your business.
As long as I'm living here, it is.
Then maybe you shouldn't be living here!
Well, that's easily fixed.